Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. I said everything was exactly where it should be. The officer seemed to believe me, scribbling down notes, indifferent to the heartbeat in my ears. The room was still, almost too still, as if the air had settled around secrets left unspoken. A faint trail of dust glimmered in the morning light, leading from the untouched bookshelf to the corner where shadows lingered a bit too persistently. The faint rustle of paper came from someplace just beyond sight, and a warmth, almost imperceptible, hovered near the drawer I hadn't dared to open. There was a small, almost invisible nick on the edge of the tabletop, something new, something wrong. Even as I spoke, that echo of intrusion hummed beneath the surface, yet I assured them nothing was amiss. The scent of varnish clung to my hands. The varnish smell returns to me now, weeks later, as I run my fingers across this different table. Smooth wood grain beneath my palm, no nicks here, but the memory of that morning pulls me backward, sideways, into fragments that never quite align. I keep thinking about the way she held her coffee cup, two hands wrapped around the ceramic as if drawing warmth from something already cold. We sat across from each other in that little cafe where the windows never seemed clean enough to see through clearly. Her voice was measured, careful. "You have to understand," she said, "there are things that don't make sense until they do." But what was she referring to? The conversation drifts back to me in pieces. Something about patterns, about noticing what others miss. Her fingers drummed against the cup in a rhythm I couldn't place, and when I asked her to repeat what she just said, she smiled in that way that suggested I'd already missed the point. The officer had asked about visitors, recent ones. I told him about the repairman who came for the heating unit, professional, quiet, left his card on the kitchen counter and departed without ceremony. But had there been someone else, the memory shifts, uncertain. A woman at the door, perhaps, asking about the previous tenant, or was that a different day entirely? Memory is unreliable. I know this now in ways I didn't before. The mind fills in gaps, creates coherence where none exists. That morning when I walked through each room, cataloging what was where, I felt the certainty of someone who knows their own space intimately. Yet doubt crept in even then, small and persistent. The bookshelf bothered me most, not because anything was missing or moved, but because of how perfectly undisturbed it appeared. Books aligned with mathematical precision. No gaps, no volumes pulled slightly forward from recent handling. It looked staged somehow, like a photograph of a bookshelf rather than one that lived in daily use. She had mentioned books during our conversation, something about how people arrange them. By color, by size, by subject, alphabetically. You can tell a lot about someone from their system, she said, or their lack of one. Mine had no system I could identify. Fiction mixed with biography, cookbooks wedged between philosophy texts. Chaos that made sense only to me. Yet that morning, staring at the shelves, I couldn't shake the feeling that some invisible hand had imposed order where none had existed before. The heating repair man, I try to remember his face, but only details emerge. Thick gloves that he never removed, even while working with small components. A toolbox that seemed too large for the simple task at hand. The way he paused at the bookshelf, studying the spines as if looking for a particular title. "Find everything you need?" I had asked. "More or less," he replied, which struck me as an odd response to a yes or no question. His card remained on the counter for days after his visit, white cardstock with black lettering. company name, phone number, license information, all perfectly legitimate when I finally thought to check, but the card itself felt wrong somehow, too crisp, too new, as if printed specifically for that single interaction. The woman at the door, did she exist? The memory feels less solid each time I examine it. A figure in a dark coat asking questions about the building's history, about who had lived in my unit before me. I told her I didn't know, which was true. The landlord had been vague about the previous tenant, mentioning only that they'd left suddenly mid-lease. "People do that sometimes," he'd said with a shrug. "Life gets complicated." But complications leave traces, forwarding addresses, damaged deposits, stories that neighbors whisper in hallways. There had been none of that, just empty rooms and the lingering scent of someone else's life, faint and unidentifiable. The officer's pen scratched against his notepad, steady, rhythmic, like her fingers drumming against the coffee cup, like the heating unit cycling on and off in the background of our daily routines. Patterns within patterns, all of them meaning something I couldn't quite grasp. "Any idea why someone might want to search your place?" he asked. I shook my head, but the lie felt heavy. There were reasons, weren't there? Things I'd found, things I'd noticed. The previous tenant hadn't vanished completely. Traces remained for those who knew how to look. Behind the bathroom mirror, a small envelope taped to the wall. Inside, a single photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, standing in front of a building that looked familiar but which I couldn't place. No date, no inscription, just the image and the questions it raised. The photograph now sits in my desk drawer between old bills and forgotten receipts. Sometimes I take it out and study the woman's face, searching for clues I might have missed. Her expression is neutral, almost blank, but her posture suggests tension, as if she's aware of being watched. Is this why someone came to retrieve what the previous tenant had hidden? The heating repair provided perfect cover, official, expected, a reason to move through rooms, to observe, to search without suspicion. But the search, if that's what it was, had been subtle, professional, nothing obviously disturbed, only that sense of wrongness, that feeling of space rearranged by foreign hands, the nick in the table, the too perfect bookshelf, the drawer that seemed slightly looser on its tracks. She had warned me about this, hadn't she? During that calf conversation that grows hazier each time I try to recall it precisely. Something about people who specialize in invisible intrusion, who can search a space so carefully that the owner never knows for certain whether anything happened at all. "Doubt is their greatest weapon," she said, or did she? The words feel true, but their source remains unclear. I find myself checking the apartment obsessively now, taking photographs of how things are arranged so I'll know if they change, but the photographs themselves become evidence of my uncertainty. Why would someone document their own space unless they feared it being violated? The heating works perfectly. Whatever the repairman did, he did it well, but I've started listening to the unit's cycles, memorizing its rhythms. Any change might signal another visit, another search, another careful rearrangement of my life. The photograph haunts me, not the image itself, but its implications. Why hide it? Why leave it behind? The woman's face offers no answers, but her eyes seem to follow me as I move through the apartment, checking locks, testing windows, searching for signs of entry that may or may not exist. Sometimes I think about calling the number on the repairman's card, not to complain about the work, but to ask questions, to probe for inconsistencies in his story. But what would I say? That I suspect him of searching my apartment while fixing my heating, based on what evidence? A feeling, a sense of wrongness that I can't quite articulate. The officer had been polite but skeptical. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing. No damage beyond that tiny nick in the table, which could have been there for months without my noticing. His report would reflect what I told him, that nothing was amiss, that everything was exactly where it should be. But lying to the police creates its own complications. If something does surface later, if the photograph leads somewhere, if the previous tenant's story becomes relevant to some larger investigation, my deception will matter. The scent of varnish on my hands will take on new meaning. I wash my hands frequently now, but the smell persists. Not the actual odor, I think, but the memory of it. The association with that morning, with the officer's questions, with the weight of secrets I'm not sure I should be keeping. The woman in the photograph could be anyone, a relative, a friend, a stranger who happened to be standing in the right place when someone needed to test their camera. But hidden photographs suggest hidden stories, and hidden stories attract the kind of attention that leaves invisible marks on bookshelves and mysterious nicks on table edges. I've considered destroying the photograph, burning it, tearing it into pieces small enough to flush away. But doing so would eliminate the only evidence I have that something unusual happened here, that the previous tenant left more than just fading scents and forwarding address mysteries. The cafe where we met has closed, not permanently, but for renovations that seem to stretch on indefinitely. When I walk past, the windows are covered with brown paper, and no signs indicate when they might reopen. Another connection severed, another source of answers that may never have existed in the first place. Her words echo in my memory, but I'm no longer certain which words are hers and which are my own attempts to make sense of confusion. There are things that don't make sense until they do. But what if they never do? What if the pattern I'm trying to discern is just random events colliding in ways that feel meaningful but aren't? The heating unit cycles on. I count the seconds until it cycles off. 47. Yesterday it was 45. The day before, 49. Normal variation or evidence of ongoing tampering. I make notes, but the numbers blur together into meaningless data. My neighbors have begun to avoid me. Not obviously, but I notice the way conversations end when I approach, how mailbox encounters become rushed affairs. Word spreads in apartment buildings. The man who called the police about nothing. The man who sees threats in repair visits and conspiracy in coffee conversations. Maybe they're right to be cautious. Maybe I've become someone worth avoiding. The photograph has changed me, or the search has changed me, or the simple act of lying to that officer has changed me into someone who can no longer distinguish between genuine threat and paranoid imagination. But the nick in the table is real. I run my finger across it daily, feeling the sharp edge where wood splintered. Something caused that damage, something or someone, and if that much is true, then other things might be true as well. The trail of dust I noticed that morning has long since been cleaned away, but I remember its path from bookshelf to corner, as if someone had moved carefully through the space, disturbing the settled particles just enough to create a visible track, footprints in dust, evidence of presence. Unless I imagined it, unless the morning light created patterns that weren't really there, and my suspicious mind transformed natural shadows into evidence of intrusion. Memory is unreliable, I know this, but knowing it doesn't make the memories less vivid or the fears less real. The photograph stares back at me from my desk drawer. The woman's neutral expression might be hiding anything: fear, guilt, knowledge, or it might be hiding nothing at all. Just the blank look of someone caught between one moment and the next, unaware that her image would someday become the center of someone else's mystery. I think about her often now. who she was, where she is. Whether she knows that her photograph survived whatever happened to the person who hid it. Whether she would recognize the importance it's taken on in my daily routine of checking locks and testing windows and listening to heating units cycle on and off. The scent of varnish has faded from my hands, but it lingers in my memory. Sharp, chemical, wrong, like the smell of something trying too hard to appear normal, to blend in, to avoid detection while conducting business that can't bear scrutiny. Everything was exactly where it should be. I said those words with conviction that morning, but they feel hollow now. How can anything be where it should be when we don't know where we are ourselves? When the ground beneath our feet shifts with each new piece of information, each recovered memory, each doubt that takes root and grows. The officer closed his notepad and left, his report filed away somewhere, another minor incident in a city full of them. But I remain here in this space that may or may not have been searched, holding this photograph that may or may not mean anything, listening to heating units and counting seconds, and wondering if the woman in the dark coat ever really stood at my door asking questions about previous tenants. The truth feels close sometimes, just beyond reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue, but reaching for it only pushes it further away, and the harder I try to grasp what happened, the more elusive it becomes. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps some truths aren't meant to be caught, only glimpsed from the corner of your eye before they disappear again into shadow. The varnish scent returns unbidden, and I'm back in that morning light, watching dust motes dance in air that felt too still, speaking words I didn't quite believe to an officer who didn't quite care. Everything exactly where it should be, but where should anything be, really? And how would we know if we found it? Story 2. The watch on my wrist pulsed twice, a heartbeat out of order. I had fastened it securely, the clasp clicking shut with a finality that should have been reassuring. The pages of the newspaper rustled in a breeze that wasn't there, headlines blurring as if the print had shifted overnight. My footsteps echoed in the hallway, but the rhythm faltered, a single step repeating like a question left hanging. The carpet felt rougher, fibers standing against my skin. In the stillness, a vase tilted, paused, then corrected itself. Something had changed, and yet the mirror still reflected my face, though slightly askew. I knew what had happened that night. The facts were clear, arranged in my mind like evidence laid out on a table. My neighbor had been found at the bottom of the stairwell in our apartment building. The police called it an accident. She had been drinking, they said. The empty wine bottle in her apartment confirmed it. She must have stumbled, lost her footing on those steep concrete steps that led to the basement laundry room. It was tragic but simple. People slip and fall. It happens all the time. I was the one who found her. I had gone down to switch my laundry from the washer to the dryer, just like I did every week. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, casting everything in that harsh, institutional glow. She was lying there at the bottom of the stairs, her neck bent at an impossible angle, one shoe missing. Her keys had scattered across the floor, the metal pieces catching the light like scattered stars. I called for help immediately. My hands were steady as I dialed. My voice was calm when I spoke to the dispatcher. I waited by her side until the paramedics arrived, though it was clear she was beyond help. The detective who interviewed me later said I had done everything right. I was a good neighbor, he said, a good citizen. The investigation was brief. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The security cameras in the building had been broken for months, something the landlord kept promising to fix but never did. The other tenants had heard nothing unusual. The woman had been going through a difficult divorce, her sister told the police. She had been drinking more lately, staying up late, making noise in the apartment above mine. I remembered those sounds now, the footsteps pacing back and forth across my ceiling, the occasional thud of something being dropped or thrown. I had thought about complaining to the landlord, but I never did. She was going through a hard time. We all have hard times. But as I stood in my apartment the morning after the funeral, watching that watch pulse against my wrist, I felt the first hairline crack in my certainty. The watch had belonged to her. I stared down at it, the silver band catching the morning light streaming through my window. When had I put it on? I couldn't remember. It had been on my nightstand when I woke up, and I had fastened it to my wrist without thinking, the way you do with familiar objects, but it wasn't familiar, it was hers. I had seen it on her wrist countless times when we passed in the hallway or waited for the elevator together. She had a habit of checking it constantly, tapping the face with her fingernail when she was anxious. The sound used to annoy me. Tap, 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 like a woodpecker against glass. How had it gotten into my apartment? I tried to retrace my steps from that night. I had found her body, called for help, waited with the paramedics and police. There had been so much activity, so many people moving through the building. Perhaps in all the confusion, someone had handed it to me. Perhaps it had fallen off her wrist and I had picked it up without thinking. But that didn't feel right. The watch was still working, still keeping perfect time. If it had been damaged in the fall, wouldn't it have stopped? And the band showed no signs of being torn or broken. The clasp worked smoothly, as if it had been carefully removed. I walked to my kitchen window and looked down at the courtyard below. From this angle, I could see the basement entrance where she had fallen. The door was propped open, as it always was during the day. A maintenance worker was hosing down the concrete steps, washing away the last traces of what had happened there. The newspaper on my counter rustled, though I was sure I had closed the window. I turned to look at it, and the headline seemed different than it had been this morning. Had it always said what it said now? I couldn't be sure. The words seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, like objects in peripheral vision that refused to hold their shape. I thought about the wine bottle the police had found in her apartment. They had used it to explain her condition, her unsteady gait, her fatal misstep, but I had never seen her drink wine. In the few conversations we had shared over the months we had been neighbors, she had mentioned being allergic to sulfites. She drank vodka instead, clear and clean, she had said. Wine gave her headaches. This detail had seemed unimportant at the time. People's habits change, especially when they're under stress. Maybe she had run out of vodka. Maybe someone had given her the wine as a gift. Maybe she had decided to drink it despite the headaches, seeking any kind of numbness to dull whatever pain she was carrying. But now, with her watch warm against my skin, the detail felt heavier, more significant. I walked through my apartment, trying to shake off the growing unease. Everything looked the same as it always had. My books lined up on their shelves, my coffee mug in the sink, my jacket hanging on the back of the chair. But the proportions felt wrong somehow, as if the room had been stretched or compressed in subtle ways that I couldn't quite identify. The vase on my dining table caught my attention. It was a simple glass piece, nothing special, filled with artificial flowers that never needed water or care. But as I watched, it seemed to tilt slightly, as if the table beneath it was uneven. I reached out to steady it, and my fingers came away dusty. When had I last cleaned it? When had I last paid attention to anything in this room? I tried to remember the weeks leading up to her death. What had I been doing? How had I been spending my time? The memories felt fuzzy, indistinct, like trying to recall a dream after waking. I knew I had been going to work, coming home, following my routines, but the specifics eluded me. There had been the sounds from upstairs, of course. Those had been constant, not just footsteps, but other noises too. Furniture being moved, doors slamming. Sometimes what sounded like crying, though it was hard to be sure through the ceiling and walls. I had learned to tune it out, to focus on my television or my books instead. But there had been other sounds too, hadn't there? Sounds that seemed to come from my own apartment, sounds I couldn't explain. I walked to my bedroom and stood in front of the mirror mounted on my closet door. My reflection looked back at me, but something was off. The angle was wrong, as if the mirror had been moved slightly from its usual position. Or maybe I was standing in a different spot than I usually did. Everything felt shifted, displaced by inches that added up to a fundamental wrongness. My face in the mirror looked tired. When had I last slept well? I couldn't remember. The nights had been restless lately, filled with half-dreams and strange sensations. Sometimes I would wake up convinced that someone was in the apartment with me, but when I turned on the lights, I was always alone. The watch pulsed again, that irregular heartbeat against my wrist. I tried to unfasten it, but my fingers fumbled with the clasp. It seemed more complicated than it should be, as if the mechanism had changed since I had put it on. When I finally managed to remove it, my wrist felt naked and exposed, marked by a pale band of skin that suggested I had been wearing it for much longer than just this morning. I set the watch on my dresser and backed away from it, as if it might move on its own. The metal face reflected the overhead light, creating small dancing spots on the ceiling. I watched these patterns for what felt like a long time, trying to make sense of their movement. The police had been thorough, I reminded myself. They had asked all the right questions, examined all the evidence. If there had been anything suspicious about her death, they would have found it. They were professionals. They knew what to look for. But what if they had missed something? What if the evidence they needed was here, in my apartment, in the form of a watch that shouldn't exist on my wrist? I thought about the detective who had interviewed me. He had been kind but efficient, asking about what I had seen and heard, taking notes in a small pad that he kept in his shirt pocket. I had answered honestly, or at least I thought I had, but memory is a fragile thing, easily influenced by expectation and fear. Had I really gone down to the laundry room to switch my clothes from washer to dryer? I tried to visualize the sequence of events. I remembered the decision to go downstairs. I remembered gathering my laundry basket and my detergent. I remembered opening my apartment door and stepping into the hallway. But what came next felt less certain. Had I actually made it to the laundry room? Had I found her on my way down or on my way back up? The timeline that had seemed so clear in my mind began to blur at the edges. I walked back to the kitchen and opened the cabinet where I kept my laundry supplies. The detergent bottle was there, but it was fuller than I expected it to be. If I had done laundry that night, wouldn't I have used some of it? And where were the clothes I had supposedly washed and dried? I couldn't remember bringing them back upstairs. The apartment felt smaller than it had this morning, the walls pressing in with each revelation. I needed air, space to think. I decided to go for a walk, to clear my head and try to make sense of what I was discovering. But as I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. What if leaving the apartment was a mistake? What if someone was waiting for me to go, planning to search my home while I was away? The thought seemed paranoid, but paranoia and caution can look very similar from the inside. I peered through the peephole instead. The hallway was empty, lit by the same fluorescent fixtures that illuminated the basement stairs. The carpet showed the tracks of a recent vacuuming, parallel lines that led from one end of the corridor to the other. But there were other marks too, scuff marks and stains that hadn't been there before. Or maybe they had always been there, and I was only now learning to see them. The elevator at the end of the hall stood open, waiting. Its interior light flickered intermittently, creating a strobe effect that made me dizzy to watch. I had ridden in that elevator countless times, but now it looked different, smaller, more confined, the kind of space where things could happen without anyone hearing. I turned away from the door and walked back through my apartment, seeing it with new eyes. The furniture I had lived with for months now seemed foreign, arranged in patterns I didn't remember choosing. The books on my shelves were out of order, spines facing the wrong directions. The artificial flowers in the vase had changed color, or maybe the light in the room had shifted to reveal their true hues. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. This reflection seemed more honest than the one in the bedroom, showing me details I had been avoiding. The dark circles under my eyes, the way my hands shook slightly when I wasn't paying attention to them, the scratch on my forearm that I couldn't remember getting. When had I last eaten? When had I last left the apartment for something other than work? The routines that had structured my life seemed to have dissolved without my noticing, leaving me adrift in a space that no longer felt entirely mine. I returned to the living room and sat on the couch, trying to reconstruct the events of that night with more precision. But the harder I focused, the more the memories seemed to slip away, like water running between my fingers. What I was left with were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that might not even belong to the same picture. The sound of footsteps above me, but her apartment was empty now, sealed off by police tape that had only recently been removed. Who could be walking around up there? The footsteps were slow, deliberate, following the same path I remembered from when she was alive. From the bedroom to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the living room, back and forth in an endless loop. Sometimes they paused, as if whoever was up there had stopped to look at something or listen for sounds from below. I grabbed a broom from my closet and used the handle to tap on the ceiling. The footsteps stopped immediately, as if whoever was up there had been waiting for exactly this signal. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the noise had been. Minutes passed, then the footsteps resumed, but now they seemed to be following a different pattern, moving in response to my own movements through the apartment. When I walked to the kitchen, the sounds moved to the area directly above. When I returned to the living room, they followed. I was being watched or copied or mocked. I picked up my phone to call the building manager, but stopped before dialing. What would I say? That I heard footsteps in an empty apartment, that my dead neighbor's watch had appeared on my wrist, that the newspaper headlines kept changing when I wasn't looking. None of it sounded credible, even to me. Instead, I found myself scrolling through the photos on my phone, looking for images from the night she died. There were none, of course. Why would I have taken pictures of such a scene? But there were other photos, older ones, that I didn't remember taking. Pictures of my apartment from unusual angles, close-ups of objects that seemed random and meaningless, and several photos that appeared to have been taken from my window, looking down at the courtyard and the basement entrance. The timestamps showed they had been taken over the course of several weeks, always late at night. In one of the photos, I could see a figure near the basement door. The image was too blurry and distant to make out details, but the person appeared to be carrying something, or someone. I enlarged the photo as much as the phone would allow, but the pixels broke apart into meaningless squares of color. The figure could have been anyone, could have been me. The watch on the dresser caught the light again, sending those dancing reflections across the walls. I had left it there when I removed it, but now it seemed to have moved, just slightly, just enough to change the angle of the reflected light. I approached it carefully, as if it were a wild animal that might bolt if startled. The metal was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been sitting in an empty room. The The face showed the correct time, but the second hand moved in small jerks rather than a smooth sweep. Tick, 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 like a heartbeat, like someone tapping their fingernail against glass. When I picked it up, it started again, that irregular pulse against my palm, as if the watch itself were alive, were breathing. I wanted to throw it away, to get it out of my apartment and out of my life, but something stopped me. Some recognition that this watch was evidence of something, even if I couldn't yet understand what. I fastened it back onto my wrist and immediately felt a sense of completion, as if a circuit had been closed. The apartment around me seemed to settle into its proper proportions. The vase stopped tilting. The newspaper headlines held still. But with that stability came a new kind of uncertainty. If the watch belonged here, if it belonged with me, what did that mean about the night she died? What did that mean about who I was, about what I might have done? The footsteps above me had stopped again, but now I could hear other sounds. Water running through pipes, a door closing, the soft thud of something being set down on a hard surface. Someone was definitely up there, moving through her apartment, going through her things. Or maybe I was hearing echoes of the past, sounds that had soaked into the building's structure and were only now being released. Maybe the apartment itself was trying to tell me something, trying to show me what had really happened that night. I closed my eyes and tried to let the memories come without forcing them. Sometimes the truth hides just beneath the surface of consciousness, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I saw myself standing in the hallway outside my apartment. The fluorescent lights were flickering, creating pools of shadow between the bright spots. I was holding something in my hands, but I couldn't see what it was. My reflection in the elevator doors looked strange, distorted, like a funhouse mirror that showed you who you might become rather than who you were. The basement door was open, as it always was, but there were sounds coming from down there that didn't belong, not the usual hum of washing machines or the clank of old pipes, something else. Something that made me want to investigate and run away at the same time. I descended the stairs slowly, my footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. The smell down there was different than usual, not just the musty odor of a basement, but something sharper, something that made my eyes water. At the bottom of the stairs, I found her. But in this memory, she wasn't alone. I was there too, standing over her, holding something that glinted in the harsh fluorescent light. Her eyes were open, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, surprise, recognition. The memory fragmented there, breaking apart like the pixels in the phone photo. I opened my eyes and found myself back in my living room, the watch pulsing steadily against my wrist. Had that been a real memory, or just my imagination trying to fill in the gaps? The line between the two had become impossibly blurred. I no longer trusted my own mind to distinguish between what had happened and what might have happened, between truth and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of senseless things. But the watch knew, the watch remembered. I looked around my apartment one more time, seeing it now as it truly was. Not a home, but a stage set. Not a sanctuary, but a hiding place. The objects around me weren't just furniture and belongings, but props in a story I had been telling myself, a story that was finally beginning to unravel. The mirror on the closet door reflected my face, but the angle was still wrong, still askew, because the person looking back at me wasn't quite the same person who had looked into that mirror before. The certainty was gone, replaced by questions that might never have answers. Outside, I could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. Whether they were coming for me or for someone else, I couldn't say. But the sound felt inevitable, like the final note in a song that had been building toward this moment all along. The watch pulsed twice, a heartbeat out of order, and I finally understood that some truths are too dangerous to know completely. Some stories are better left unfinished, hanging in the space between what we remember and what we choose to forget. The footsteps above me began again, following their familiar pattern. But now I wondered if they had ever really stopped, or if I had simply learned not to hear them. And I wondered who would be walking those floors when I was gone, what sounds my own footsteps would make in the memories of whoever came after. The newspaper rustled one final time, and I didn't look to see what the headlines said now. Some words are better left unread. Story 3. I assured them I hadn't noticed anything unusual. The air in the room seemed to press against my skin, thick with the scent of pine and something sharper, like fresh-turned earth. The curtains hung perfectly still, refusing to betray the draft that whispered through the cracked window, brushing against the back of my neck. A scuff mark near the far wall stood out, an unexpected blemish on the otherwise immaculate floor. Beneath the low hum of the overhead lights, the sound of my pulse throbbed in my ears, steady, insistent. And beyond the closed door, the whisper of a movement lingered. My footsteps were silent, but I was certain I wasn't alone. But that was a lie, wasn't it? I had noticed something. The question they asked me seemed simple enough at the time, but sitting here now, replaying that conversation over and over, I realize how loaded it was. They wanted to know if I'd seen anything out of place that evening, anything that might have suggested trouble was brewing. The truth is, I thought I knew exactly what had happened. The sequence of events seemed clear in my mind, logical and straightforward. I'd arrived at the house just after sunset, the sky still holding that deep purple glow that makes everything look softer than it really is. The front door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning, but I convinced myself it was just carelessness. People forget to lock doors all the time. I called out when I entered, my voice echoing through the hallway. No response. The silence felt heavy, but not threatening, just empty. I moved through the rooms methodically, checking each one. The kitchen showed signs of recent use, a coffee mug still warm to the touch, a newspaper folded open to the crossword puzzle half completed. Someone had been there recently, maybe stepped out for a quick errand. The living room looked undisturbed, cushions plumped, magazines fanned across the coffee table in that deliberate way that suggests someone cares about appearances. The television was off, but the remote lay on the arm of the chair, positioned as if someone had just set it down. I remember thinking how normal everything looked, how peaceful. That's when I climbed the stairs to check the bedrooms. My hand slid along the banister, smooth, wood-worn soft by countless touches. The floorboards creaked under my weight, announcing my presence to the empty house. At the top of the stairs, I paused. 3 doors faced me, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, all closed. I opened the first door slowly, not wanting to startle anyone who might be resting inside. The room was neat, bed made with military precision. Clothes hung in the closet, shoes lined up beneath them. Nothing seemed amiss. The second bedroom told the same story, everything in its place, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. It was in that second bedroom where I found the note, a simple piece of paper, folded once, lying on the nightstand. The handwriting was familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. The message was brief, had to leave suddenly. Don't worry, we'll explain everything soon. That explained it, I thought, an emergency, maybe a family matter that required immediate attention. It happens. People get called away without warning. The unlocked door, the warm coffee mug, the half-finished crossword, all evidence of someone who had to leave in a hurry. But even as I constructed this rational explanation, something nagged at me. The note bothered me, though I couldn't articulate why. The paper felt wrong somehow, too crisp, too white, and the handwriting, while familiar, seemed forced, as if someone was trying too hard to make it look natural. I left the house that evening convinced I understood what had happened. When the authorities questioned me later, I told them about the note, about the signs of hasty departure. They nodded, took notes, seemed satisfied with my account. Case closed, or so I thought. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying my walk through that house. Details began to shift in my memory, small things that hadn't registered fully at the time. The coffee mug, had it really been warm? The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. Maybe it had just felt warm because my hands were cold from the evening air. And the crossword puzzle. I remembered it being half completed, but now I wondered, had the answers been written in the same pen? Some of the letters seemed darker than others, as if they'd been filled in at different times, or by different hands. The scuff mark on the floor that I'd noticed initially began to take on new significance in my restless mind. It was near the far wall, about the right height to have been made by a shoe. But a shoe doing what? Kicking, struggling. The mark was dark against the light wood, and now that I thought about it, it looked fresh. I got up and made myself a cup of tea, hoping the familiar ritual would calm my racing thoughts. But as I stood in my kitchen, waiting for the water to boil, I was struck by a sudden, vivid memory. Or was it a memory? It felt more like a dream, but with the sharp edges of reality. I was back in that house, but this time I wasn't alone. I could hear breathing that wasn't mine, feel a presence just out of sight. The air was thicker, more oppressive, and that scent of pine was overwhelming now, mixed with something metallic that made my stomach turn. In this version of events, the front door hadn't been unlocked through carelessness. It had been left open deliberately, as an invitation or perhaps as an escape route. The warm coffee mug took on sinister implications. Someone had been there, yes, but maybe they hadn't left voluntarily. Maybe they'd been interrupted mid-sip, forced to abandon their morning routine by something unexpected and unwelcome. I saw myself climbing those stairs again, but this time my steps were hesitant, fearful. The creaking floorboards weren't just announcing my presence, they were warning whatever waited above that I was coming. At the top of the stairs, those 3 closed doors looked different, ominous, hiding secrets instead of simply enclosing empty rooms. The first bedroom, so neat and orderly in my initial recollection, now seemed staged. The military precision of the bed-making looked obsessive, desperate. The clothes in the closet hung too perfectly, as if someone had arranged them to hide evidence of a struggle. And those shoes, lined up so carefully beneath, were they all facing the same direction? In my new memory, they seemed to point toward the window, as if their owner had been planning an escape. But it was the second bedroom that haunted this alternative version of events. The note was still there, still folded neatly on the nightstand, but now I could see what I'd missed before. The paper wasn't just crisp and white, it was new, unmarked by the dust that covered everything else in the room. And the handwriting, so familiar yet forced, now struck me as a crude imitation. Someone had copied another's writing style, but imperfectly. Worse still, in this shadow version of my memory, I wasn't alone in that room. Someone stood behind me as I read the note, close enough that I could feel their breath on my neck, smell the scent of earth and pine that clung to their clothes. When I turned around, expecting to see who it was, the room was empty. But the impression remained, a cold certainty that I was being watched, evaluated, judged. The whistling of the kettle snapped me back to my own kitchen, my own reality. But which reality was real? The logical sequence of events I'd reported to the authorities, or this darker version that seemed to emerge from some hidden part of my consciousness? I poured the hot water over my tea bag and tried to think rationally. Memory is unreliable, especially under stress. I'd been worried about finding the house empty, concerned about someone's unexplained absence. It was natural for my mind to conjure more dramatic explanations, to transform ordinary details into sinister clues. But as I sipped my tea, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying to myself. The scent of pine seemed to linger in my nostrils, even though there were no evergreen trees near my house. And when I looked down at my shoes, I was startled to see traces of dark earth clinging to the soles, though I couldn't remember walking anywhere that would have left such marks. I went back to bed, but sleep remained elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that house, but the layout kept changing. Sometimes the stairs led up to the bedrooms, sometimes down to a basement I hadn't noticed before. The 3 doors at the top multiplied, becoming a long hallway of identical entrances, each one hiding something I didn't want to discover. In one particularly vivid dream, if it was a dream, I found myself in the 2nd bedroom again, but this time the note was gone. In its place was a photograph, face down on the nightstand. I reached for it with trembling fingers, knowing I shouldn't look but unable to stop myself. When I turned it over, I saw my own face staring back at me, but it was wrong somehow. The eyes were too wide, the smile too forced. And written across the bottom in that same familiar yet foreign handwriting were the words, "Don't worry, we'll explain everything soon." I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The taste of earth and pine filled my mouth, and my hands were dirty as if I'd been digging in soil. I stumbled to the bathroom and scrubbed my palms raw, but the scent lingered. In the mirror, my reflection looked haggard, guilty. The eyes staring back at me were too wide, the expression too forced. The next morning brought no clarity, only more questions. I found myself driving past the house where it all began, though I hadn't consciously decided to go there. The building looked different in daylight, smaller, more ordinary, but the front door was closed now, and I couldn't tell if it was locked. I sat in my car across the street, engine running, trying to reconcile my 2 versions of that evening. In one, I was an innocent observer who had stumbled upon evidence of someone's hasty departure. In the other, I was something else entirely, a participant rather than a witness, complicit in events I couldn't quite remember. A movement in one of the upstairs windows caught my eye. Just a flutter of curtain, probably caused by the same draft I'd felt that night, but for a moment I could have sworn I saw a face looking back at me. My own face, perhaps, or maybe someone else's entirely. Someone who knew the truth about what had happened in that house, who could explain the discrepancies in my memory, who could tell me which version of events was real. But when I looked again, the window was empty, the curtain still. I drove away without getting out of the car, without knocking on the door, without seeking the answers I claimed to want, because deep down I think I already knew the truth, or at least I knew that the truth was something I wasn't ready to face. The authorities never called me back for additional questioning. The case, whatever it was, seemed to have resolved itself without my further input, but I couldn't resolve it in my own mind. The 2 narratives continued to coexist, neither one fully convincing, both equally possible. Sometimes I wonder if that's the real truth, that there is no single, definitive version of events. Maybe what happened in that house exists in the space between my 2 memories, in the uncertainty itself. Maybe the scuff mark on the floor, the warm coffee mug, the too perfect note, and the scent of pine and earth are all equally real and equally false. What I know for certain is this: I assured them I hadn't noticed anything unusual, and that was the biggest lie of all. Because everything was unusual, from the moment I stepped into that house until now, as I sit here trying to make sense of it all. The question isn't what I noticed, it's what I did with what I noticed, and why I can't seem to remember it clearly. The truth, whatever it is, remains suspended between what I think happened and what I fear might have happened. And maybe that's where it belongs, in that uncomfortable space where certainty goes to die, where the only honest answer is that I simply don't know. Story 4. The faucet dripped, paused, then a drop fell again, hesitating midair. Each morning the tiles beneath my feet whispered back the same cold greeting. Today the floor felt uneven, as if shifting beneath me like a restless sleeper. The clock on the mantel ticked twice at once, skipping a beat but catching up in the next breath. I reached for my cup, expecting warmth, only to find it chilled as my fingers brushed the surface. The scene before me blurred at the edges, and when I blinked, the door I always closed was ajar, inviting a draft I never felt before. I stared at that door, trying to remember when I had last touched the handle. The brass felt familiar under my palm when I finally closed it, but something about the weight of it seemed wrong, too light or perhaps too heavy. My fingers lingered on the metal, and I noticed a faint smudge where someone else's hand might have gripped it. The coffee in my cup had grown cold overnight. I was certain I had finished it before going to bed, yet here it sat, half full and bitter. The cream had separated into pale islands floating on the dark surface. When I lifted the cup to pour it down the sink, I caught a scent that made me pause. Not coffee, something sharper, more chemical, like the cleaning solution we used at the office, the one that burned your throat if you breathed too deeply. My neighbor had been asking questions again. She stood by her fence the previous afternoon, pruning roses that didn't need pruning, her eyes following my movements as I walked from the car to the front door. Her mouth moved in what might have been a greeting, but I couldn't hear the words through the glass. When I opened the window to respond, she had already turned away, her shears clicking against the thorns. The newspaper lay folded on the kitchen counter where I always left it, but the headline felt different somehow. The same story about the missing person case that had been running for weeks, yet the photograph seemed to have shifted slightly in its frame. The eyes in the picture looked more directly at me now, or perhaps I was finally looking back. I found myself checking the locks more frequently. The front door, the back door, the windows that faced the street, each one secure, each one exactly as I had left it, yet the ritual of checking had become necessary. My hands moved automatically to each latch, each bolt, confirming what I already knew but somehow doubted. The telephone rang while I was examining the window in the living room. The caller said they were from the police department, asking if I had noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood. Their voice sounded young, uncertain, as if they were reading from a script they hadn't quite memorized. I told them about the door I found ajar, about the neighbor with her questions, about the feeling that something had shifted in the familiar landscape of my routine. They thanked me and hung up, but I continued holding the receiver long after the dial tone began. The plastic was warm against my ear, and I wondered how many other people had answered similar questions, offered similar observations, felt the same creeping sense that the world had tilted slightly off its axis. The missing person's photograph stared back at me from the newspaper when I returned to the kitchen. A face that could have belonged to anyone, really. The kind of features that blur together in memory, that could be reconstructed differently each time you tried to recall them. I had seen this person before, I was almost certain. At the grocery store, perhaps, or walking past my house on one of those evenings when I stood at the window watching the street settle into darkness. My reflection in the kitchen window showed me a stranger's eyes. They held an expression I didn't recognize, a wariness that seemed to have appeared overnight like the cold coffee and the open door. I touched the glass, and my reflection touched back, but the timing felt off by just a fraction of a second. The basement door stood slightly open, though I was certain I had closed it after bringing up the laundry. The wooden steps descended into shadows that seemed deeper than usual. I flicked the light switch, but the bulb only illuminated the first few steps before the darkness swallowed the rest. The air rising from below carried the scent of damp earth and something else, something that reminded me of the chemical smell from my coffee cup. I descended slowly, my hand trailing along the rough wooden railing. Each step creaked under my weight, announcing my presence to whatever waited in the darkness below. The concrete floor felt gritty under my feet, and when I reached for the second light switch, my fingers found it coated with a fine layer of dust that shouldn't have accumulated since I had cleaned down here just recently. The washing machine sat in its usual corner, but the lid was raised slightly, as if someone had opened it to look inside and forgotten to close it completely. The clothes I had washed were still there, but they felt different when I touched them. Stiffer, somehow. The fabric held a coldness that seemed to penetrate through to my fingertips. Behind the water heater, I noticed a cardboard box I didn't remember storing there. The corners were soft with age, and when I lifted it, something shifted inside with a sound like papers rustling or fabric brushing against itself. The tape sealing the top had been cut and carefully replaced, leaving a thin line where the adhesive had lost its grip. Inside, I found photographs, not mine, though some of the locations looked familiar. The park where I walked on weekends, the coffee shop where I bought my morning paper, the intersection where I waited for the bus. In each image, figures moved through the familiar spaces like actors on a stage I knew by heart but had never seen from this angle. One photograph showed my own house, taken from across the street. The angle suggested the photographer had been standing behind the large oak tree, using its trunk as cover. In the picture, a figure stood at my living room window, looking out toward the camera. The face was too distant to make out clearly, but the posture was unmistakably mine. I climbed the basement steps with the box tucked under my arm, each photograph a question I couldn't answer. The kitchen felt different when I emerged, as if the familiar space had rearranged itself slightly while I was below ground. The coffee cup sat exactly where I had left it, but now it was warm to the touch. The telephone rang again, but this time no one spoke when I answered. I could hear breathing on the other end, steady and patient, as if the caller had all the time in the world to wait for me to say something first. When I finally hung up, the silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation that never happened. My neighbor appeared at her fence again, but now she faced my house directly instead of pretending to tend her garden. Her expression was unreadable from this distance, but she raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. I lifted my own hand in response, and she immediately turned away, disappearing into her house with a speed that suggested urgency. The photograph spread across my kitchen table told a story I couldn't quite piece together. Images of people I might have known, places I definitely recognized, moments that felt significant without revealing their meaning. In one picture, a car sat parked outside the coffee shop, its license plate partially obscured by shadow. The driver's silhouette suggested someone waiting, watching, documenting. I began to recognize a pattern in the timestamps visible on some of the photographs. They had been taken over a period of weeks, always at times when I would have been present in these locations. The photographer had been following a routine that mirrored my own, documenting my movements with the patience of someone conducting a long-term study. The missing person's photograph from the newspaper lay among the others, but here it was part of a series. Multiple shots of the same individual in different locations, different contexts, standing outside my office building, sitting on the bench where I ate lunch, walking past my house in the early morning hours when the street lamps still burned against the dawn. I found myself checking the locks again, but this time the ritual felt different. Instead of confirming my security, each bolt and latch seemed to highlight my vulnerability. The barriers I had trusted to keep the world at bay suddenly felt as fragile as paper, as temporary as the morning frost that melted under the first touch of sunlight. The basement called to me again, though I couldn't say why. This time I noticed details that had escaped my attention before. Scuff marks on the concrete floor that suggested heavy objects had been dragged across its surface. A water stain on the wall that formed a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. The lingering scent of that chemical smell, stronger now, as if its source was closer than I had initially thought. Behind a stack of old paint cans, I discovered a journal wrapped in plastic. The handwriting inside was careful, methodical, documenting observations with the precision of a scientist recording experimental data. My daily routines were cataloged with obsessive detail. The time I left for work, the route I took to the store, the evenings I spent standing at my window watching the street. The entry spoke of me in the third person, as if I were a subject being studied rather than a person living my life. The author noted changes in my behavior, speculated about my thoughts, recorded conversations I had no memory of having. According to these pages, I had spoken with the missing person on multiple occasions, though I couldn't recall a single interaction. The final entry was dated just days before the person's disappearance. It described a confrontation, though the details remained frustratingly vague. Words like resistance and necessary measures appeared alongside my address and a detailed floor plan of my house. The handwriting grew more erratic toward the end, as if the author had been writing quickly or under stress. I climbed the basement steps with the journal clutched against my chest, my heart beating so hard I could feel it through the plastic wrapping. The kitchen above seemed to pulse with new meaning, every familiar object now a potential clue in a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. The telephone sat silent on its cradle, but I found myself staring at it as if expecting it to ring with answers to questions I was afraid to ask. When I finally picked up the receiver to call the police, I discovered the line was dead. Not disconnected, but simply absent of the usual dial tone, as if the connection to the outside world had been severed while I explored the darkness below. My reflection in the kitchen window showed someone I barely recognized. The stranger's eyes had grown wider, more alert, but also more uncertain. The face looking back at me belonged to someone who had discovered they were living in a story they didn't understand, playing a role they had never auditioned for. The photographs on the table seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, arranging themselves into new patterns that suggested different narratives. In one configuration, they told the story of a careful surveillance operation. In another, they revealed the obsessive documentation of someone losing their grip on reality. The truth lay somewhere between these interpretations, in the spaces where certainty dissolved into possibility. As darkness settled over the house, I found myself drawn back to the basement one final time. The journal had mentioned something hidden behind the furnace, something the author referred to only as evidence of understanding. My flashlight beam revealed a small metal box wedged into the narrow space between the furnace and the foundation wall. Inside the box, I found a key that didn't match any lock in my house. A photograph of myself sleeping that could only have been taken from inside my bedroom, and a note written in my own handwriting that I had no memory of creating. The note was addressed to no one in particular, but it contained an apology for something I couldn't remember doing and a promise to make amends for a harm I couldn't recall causing. The pieces of the puzzle lay scattered around me like fragments of a mirror, each one reflecting a different version of events, a different possible truth. I could see myself as the victim of an elaborate surveillance scheme, or as someone whose grip on reality had loosened to the point where I was documenting my own life as if observing a stranger. The missing person stared back at me from the newspaper photograph, but now their face seemed to shift between familiar and unknown, between threatening and threatened. Perhaps they had been watching me, or perhaps I had been watching them. Perhaps we had been watching each other, two people caught in a spiral of observation and paranoia that had finally collapsed into something neither of us could control. I sat in my kitchen as the night deepened around me, surrounded by evidence that pointed in every direction and nowhere at all. The faucet continued its irregular dripping, marking time in a rhythm that matched my uncertain heartbeat. The door I had closed so carefully earlier stood slightly ajar again, though I was certain I hadn't touched it. The truth remained just beyond my reach, like a word balanced on the tip of my tongue that refuses to be spoken. I knew that somewhere in this accumulation of photographs, journals, and mysterious objects lay the answer to what had happened to the missing person. But I also knew that the answer might reveal something about myself that I wasn't prepared to understand. The clock on the mantel ticked its irregular rhythm, skipping beats and catching up, marking the passage of a time that felt increasingly unreliable. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of my own breathing, trying to separate what I knew from what I feared, what I remembered from what I had convinced myself to forget. When I opened my eyes again, my reflection in the kitchen window was smiling back at me, though I felt no urge to smile myself. Story 5. It used to be like clockwork every morning. The door next to mine would open with a series of predictable squeaks. First, a hesitant, high-pitched note, followed by 6 more in descending tones. It became a comforting symphony of routine, something I could count on like the ticking of a metronome. But last Tuesday, the pattern wavered after the 4th squeak. Yesterday, I swear it stopped entirely at the 6th. Today, the door opened without a sound. I can't help but wonder if it was ever supposed to stop. The silence sits heavy now where those familiar notes once lived. I find myself pressing my ear against the thin wall that separates our apartments, listening for something else: footsteps, the scrape of furniture, the soft whisper of fabric against skin. Instead, there's only the hollow echo of my own breathing reflected back at me. I've been thinking about patterns lately, how they form and break and reform into something unrecognizable. How we convince ourselves we understand the rhythm of another person's life simply because we've observed it from the outside. The woman next door, I never knew her name, though we shared the same narrow hallway for what feels like forever, had become part of my morning ritual without either of us acknowledging it. She was methodical in ways I admired. The door would squeak its 7-note song, then silence for exactly the time it took to lock the deadbolt and check it twice. Her heels would tap a steady beat down the hallway, pause at the mailboxes, then fade toward the stairwell. In the evenings, the sequence would reverse itself with clockwork precision. But precision, I've learned, can be its own kind of deception. The first time I noticed something different wasn't the squeaking door that came later. It was the smell, a sweetness that seemed to seep through the walls, cloying and persistent. I told myself it was just a new air freshener, maybe vanilla or jasmine. People change their habits, they try new things. There's nothing suspicious about wanting your home to smell pleasant. I started paying closer attention after that, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the sweetness lingered even when she wasn't home, or how it seemed strongest near the shared wall of what I assumed was her bedroom. I found myself making excuses to walk past her door, listening for signs of normal life within. The sounds were all wrong. Not absent that would have been easier to dismiss. Instead, they were muffled as if everything inside had been wrapped in cotton. Her television, which used to carry the familiar cadence of morning news through our shared wall, became a distant murmur. Her phone conversations, once clear enough that I could follow the rhythm if not the words, dissolved into indistinct whispers. I began to catalog these changes with the dedication of a scientist documenting an experiment. The way her footsteps grew lighter, almost hesitant. How the sound of running water became sporadic, unpredictable. The increasing gaps between when I heard her leave and when she returned, stretching from hours to what felt like entire days. But it was the mail that made me truly suspicious. I started checking my own mailbox more frequently, telling myself it was simple curiosity. Her box, number 12, was directly below mine. For weeks, it remained empty each time I looked. No bills, no magazines, no advertisements, nothing. As if she had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the Postal Service. That's when I began to wonder if someone else was collecting it for her. The building manager was a thin man with nervous hands who avoided eye contact when I asked about my neighbor. He mumbled something about lease agreements and privacy policies, but his fingers drummed against his clipboard in a way that suggested he knew more than he was willing to share. I noticed he didn't deny that something had changed. I started spending more time in the hallway, finding reasons to linger. Checking my own mail multiple times, pretending to search for keys while listening at her door. The sweetness had grown stronger, almost overwhelming now, and underneath it was something else, something that reminded me of the way flowers smell when they've been left too long in stagnant water. The door squeaks began their irregular pattern around this time, as if the mechanism itself was responding to whatever was happening inside. 7 squeaks became 6, then 5, then that wavering uncertainty that made my skin crawl with its wrongness. I considered calling someone, but who? The police would want evidence of a crime, and I had only suspicions and a changing pattern of door squeaks. My family would suggest I was becoming too isolated, too focused on the lives of strangers. They wouldn't understand that sometimes the absence of normal sounds is more alarming than any scream. Instead, I waited and listened and documented everything in a notebook I kept by my kitchen window. The times she left, if she left at all, the duration of silence between footsteps, the way the sweet smell seemed to pulse stronger some days than others, as if responding to temperature or humidity or something else I couldn't identify. I started having dreams about that door, about the precise sequence of squeaks that had once marked the beginning of each day. In the dreams, I would count them obsessively 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but the numbers would shift and change, becoming 8, then 12, then an endless cascade of sound that would wake me in a cold sweat. The dreams made me realize how much I had depended on that routine, how it had become an anchor point in my own daily rhythm. Without it, I felt unmoored, uncertain of when to begin my own morning preparations. I would lie in bed, waiting for the familiar sequence, and when it came incomplete or altered, the entire day would feel somehow off balance. I began to consider the possibility that I was the problem, that my obsession with my neighbor's routine had grown into something unhealthy, something that was distorting my perception of normal changes in behavior. People move away, after all. They break leases, find new jobs, fall in love with someone who lives across town. There are 1,000 innocent explanations for why someone might alter their daily patterns. But innocent explanations don't account for the way the building manager's hands shook when I mentioned her apartment number, or the fact that her mailbox remained perpetually empty while mine filled with the usual collection of bills and advertisements. They don't explain the sweet smell that grew stronger each day, or the way it seemed to follow me even after I left the building. I started researching the history of our building, spending hours at the local library scrolling through old newspaper archives and city records. Nothing dramatic, no murders or mysterious disappearances, no scandals or tragedies. Just the ordinary documentation of urban life, building permits, safety inspections, the occasional noise complaint. But buried in the records, I found something interesting. The apartment next to mine had changed hands frequently over the past several years. Not unusual in itself, rental turnover is common in buildings like ours, but the pattern was strange. Tenants would sign year-long leases and disappear within months, leaving no forwarding address. The building manager would list personal emergencies or family situations, but never anything specific. I counted 7 different tenants in the past 4 years. 7 like the squeaks of the door. This revelation should have satisfied my curiosity, provided a rational framework for understanding what I had observed. Instead, it only deepened my sense that something fundamental was wrong. I began to wonder if I had ever really seen my most recent neighbor, or if I had simply assumed the sounds I heard belonged to the same person who had lived there before. Memory, I've discovered, is less reliable than we want to believe. When I tried to recall specific encounters with the woman next door, the details became frustratingly vague. I remembered the sound of her heels in the hallway, but could I actually describe the shoes? I recalled glimpses of movement through the peephole in my door, but had I ever seen her face clearly? The more I questioned my own recollections, the more uncertain I became about everything I thought I knew. Had there been 7 squeaks or 6? Had the sweet smell been present from the beginning, or was it something new? Was the silence I now heard really more profound than before, or had I simply become more attuned to it? I decided to test my theory by staying awake all night, positioned by my door with my notebook, ready to document whatever happened in the apartment next to mine. The vigil felt both necessary and absurd, a grown person crouched in their own hallway, listening for evidence of their neighbor's existence. Nothing happened. No sounds, no movement, no variation in the sweet smell that had become as constant as the hum of the building's ventilation system. Just hours of silence so complete it seemed almost aggressive in its emptiness. By dawn, I was convinced that apartment 12 had been vacant for weeks, possibly months. But then the door opened. Not with the familiar sequence of squeaks, those had already been reduced to memory, but with the smooth, silent motion of well-oiled hinges. I pressed my eye to the peephole and saw a figure moving down the hallway, too distant and quick for me to make out details. The footsteps were different too, heavier than I remembered, with an irregular rhythm that suggested injury or fatigue. By the time I unlocked my own door and peered into the hallway, whoever it was had disappeared into the stairwell. But the sweet smell was stronger than ever, and underneath it, I caught something else, something that reminded me of copper pennies and rain-soaked earth. I stood there for a long time, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to knock on apartment 12, to finally confront whatever was happening next door. Another part whispered that some mysteries are better left unsolved, that the truth might be more disturbing than the uncertainty. In the end, I did nothing. I returned to my apartment and made coffee and tried to convince myself that everything I had witnessed could be explained by perfectly ordinary circumstances. New tenant, different routine, unfamiliar cleaning products. The The building manager had probably resolved whatever issues existed with apartment 12, and life was returning to normal. But normal, I was beginning to understand, is just another word for the patterns we choose to accept. The door next to mine still opens each morning, though never with the predictable sequence I once found so comforting. Sometimes it's silent, sometimes it groans with sounds I don't recognize. The footsteps that follow are inconsistent, heavy one day, light the next, occasionally absent altogether. The sweet smell comes and goes like a tide, strongest in the early morning hours when the building is otherwise still. I've stopped keeping my notebook, stopped checking the mailbox with such frequency, stopped pressing my ear to the wall in search of familiar sounds. Not because my curiosity has been satisfied, but because I've realized that some questions don't have answers that would bring peace. Instead, I've learned to live with uncertainty, to find a different kind of rhythm in the unpredictable patterns that now mark my days. I've discovered that mystery can be its own form of companionship, that wondering about someone can create a strange intimacy even when you never learn their name. The door next to mine opened this morning without a sound, just as it did yesterday and the day before. I find myself listening for those 7 familiar squeaks, waiting for the return of that comforting routine I once took for granted. But silence has become the new constant, and I can't help but wonder if it was always meant to be this way, if the sounds I remember so clearly were just an interruption in a deeper quiet that was always there, waiting to reclaim its space. I press my ear to the wall one more time, listening for something, anything, that might tell me I'm not alone in this building after all. Instead, there's only the hollow echo of my own breathing, reflected back at me like a question I'm not ready to answer. Story 6. I shut the book with a soft thud, the dust motes dancing briefly before settling back onto the worn wood. The air was heavy, tinged with an unfamiliar musk that prickled the back of my throat. My fingertips brushed the surface of the table, tracing invisible lines where polish had once been. The room felt still, too still, like an unstrung instrument waiting to sound. As I moved toward the door, the floorboards whispered beneath my feet, and for a moment, the lines I'd just drawn felt like they were carved into the wood itself. I knew what had happened in that room. The story was simple, really. A woman had been staying in the house alone while her husband traveled for work. She spent her evenings reading in the study, just as I had been doing. The book I'd closed was hers, a collection of poetry with her neat annotations filling the margins. She'd been methodical about it, underlining passages about loss and transformation with the same careful precision she used for everything else. The police report was clear. She'd fallen down the stairs sometime during the night. The coroner estimated it happened around 2 a.m. Her husband found her when he returned from his business trip, crumpled at the bottom of the narrow staircase that connected the study to the main floor. A tragic accident, the kind of thing that happens when old houses meet tired feet and poor lighting. I'd been hired by the insurance company to assess the claim. Standard procedure for cases involving significant payouts. The husband wanted to sell the house, couldn't bear to live there anymore, which anyone could understand. My job was to walk through the space, document the conditions, and verify that nothing suggested anything other than what the official report concluded. The staircase was steep, I'll give it that. The handrail wobbled when I tested it, loose screws creating just enough give to make you question your grip. The carpet runner had worn thin in places, creating potential snags for bare feet or house slippers. At the bottom, a sharp corner jutted out from the newel post, exactly the kind of architectural detail that could cause the injuries described in the medical examiner's report. Everything fit, everything made sense. But as I stood in that study, breathing in the stale air that carried hints of something I couldn't quite identify, the certainty I'd felt when I first read the file began to shift. It started with the book itself. The poetry collection lay open to a page she'd marked heavily, verses about deliberate choices and calculated risks. The handwriting in the margins wasn't just neat, it was obsessive. Every letter formed with identical pressure, identical spacing. This wasn't the casual reading of someone passing time while alone. This was the work of someone studying. I flipped through more pages. The annotations grew denser toward the end of the book, clustering around poems that dealt with endings and new beginnings. One passage was circled so many times the pen had worn through the paper. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The musk I'd noticed when I first entered seemed stronger now, or maybe I was just paying more attention. It reminded me of something organic, something that belonged outside rather than in this closed-up room. I followed the scent toward the window, where heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light. When I pulled them back, dust cascaded down like snow, and I could see the garden beyond the glass. The flower beds were overgrown but not abandoned. Someone had been tending them recently. The soil around the base of several plants looked freshly turned, dark and rich against the pale stones that bordered the beds. Roses climbed the trellis beside the window, their blooms heavy and almost too perfect. The sweet, cloying fragrance drifted through a gap in the window frame, mixing with that earthier smell I'd noticed inside. I returned to the staircase with different eyes. The worn carpet runner that had seemed like an obvious hazard now looked deliberately placed. The loose handrail, when I examined it more closely, showed recent scratches around the screws, the kind of marks that come from repeated tightening and loosening. Someone had been adjusting it, testing it. The husband's story replayed in my mind as I descended the stairs, counting each step. He'd said he found her at the bottom when he returned from his trip, called emergency services immediately, waited with her until the paramedics arrived, though there was nothing they could do. He'd been composed during our interview, grief-stricken but not hysterical, practical about the insurance claim, the house sale, the need to move forward. But now I remembered other details, the way he'd known exactly which book she'd been reading that night, though he claimed he hadn't spoken to her the day she died. His precise recollection of her bedtime routine, down to which slippers she wore, and how she liked to leave the study light on when she went upstairs. The fact that he'd returned from his business trip a day early, something he mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought. I found myself standing at the exact spot where she'd been found. The corner of the newel post loomed above me, its sharp edge catching the dim light from the hallway fixture. The impact would have been severe, certainly fatal, but as I knelt there, running my fingers along the baseboards, I noticed something the initial investigation might have missed. The dust patterns were wrong. In a house that had been closed up for weeks, dust settles in predictable ways. It accumulates in corners, along edges, in the spaces where air doesn't circulate freely. But here at the base of the stairs, the dust had been disturbed in ways that didn't match the story of a single fall. There were clean spots where something had been moved, drag marks so faint they were almost invisible unless you were looking for them. I photographed everything, though I wasn't sure what I was documenting. Evidence of what? The husband had an alibi for the night she died, hotel receipts, restaurant charges, a conference attendance record that placed him hundreds of miles away. The timeline was solid, verified by multiple sources. Unless it wasn't. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. The hotel confirmed his reservation, but when I pressed for details about his actual presence that night, the desk clerk became uncertain. The room key had been used, yes, but housekeeping noted the bed hadn't been slept in. The restaurant charge was from the hotel bar, processed automatically when he checked out. Anyone could have made that purchase at any time during his stay. The conference was more problematic. His registration was legitimate, but attendance at individual sessions wasn't tracked. The networking dinner he'd mentioned specifically had been canceled due to a kitchen fire. The information was buried in the conference website's news section, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Back in the study, I opened the poetry book again. This time I noticed something I'd overlooked before. The pages weren't just annotated, they were coded. The underlined passages, when read in sequence, told a different story entirely. Words about escape, about freedom from unbearable circumstances, about the courage required to take decisive action. The final annotation on the very last page was different from the others. The handwriting was shakier, more urgent. He knows I know. I sat back in the chair where she'd spent her last evening, trying to piece together what she'd discovered and when. The careful annotations suggested weeks or months of planning, but planning for what? Her own death seemed impossible. The physical evidence didn't support suicide. But if not that, then what had she been preparing for? The answer came to me gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. She hadn't been planning her death. She'd been planning her escape. The garden outside the window took on new significance. The freshly turned soil, the carefully tended plants. Someone had been preparing that space for something specific. I thought about the insurance payout, substantial enough to fund a new life somewhere else. I thought about the husband's convenient alibi, constructed with just enough holes to be believable, but not quite enough to be airtight. But if she'd been planning to disappear, why was she dead at the bottom of the stairs? The question followed me as I left the house, as I drove through streets that seemed suddenly unfamiliar despite the clear directions on my GPS. The certainty I'd felt when I first took the case had evaporated completely, replaced by something that felt like vertigo. Every answer I'd found only generated more questions, and the questions were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the poetry book, about the woman who'd filled its margins with her careful observations and desperate plans. Had she discovered something about her husband that made staying impossible, or had he discovered something about her that made letting her leave equally impossible? I realized I'd been thinking about the case wrong from the beginning. I'd assumed the truth was binary accident or murder, victim or perpetrator, innocent or guilty. But what if the reality was more complex? What if both of them had been planning, scheming, preparing for an outcome that neither of them ultimately controlled? The insurance investigation suddenly felt like the least important part of the puzzle. What mattered was understanding what had really happened in that house, in the days and weeks leading up to that night when everything went wrong. But the more I learned, the less certain I became about anything. I found myself questioning not just the evidence, but my own perceptions of it. Had I really seen those dust patterns, or had I imagined them because I wanted to find something suspicious? Were the garden beds actually freshly tended? Or was I projecting significance onto ordinary seasonal maintenance? Had the poetry annotations really formed a coherent narrative, or was I creating connections that existed only in my own mind? The case file sat open on my kitchen table, photographs and reports spread out like tarot cards promising revelations that never quite materialized. The official story remained unchanged: a tragic accident, a grieving widower, a routine insurance claim. But underneath that simple narrative, I could feel something else moving, something that defied easy categorization. I started to wonder if the truth mattered as much as I'd thought it did. The woman was dead regardless of how she died. The husband would collect his insurance money regardless of whether he deserved it. The house would be sold to someone who would never know about the poetry book or the garden or the staircase that might or might not have been tampered with. But I couldn't let it go. Something about the case had gotten under my skin, into my dreams, into the spaces between my conscious thoughts. I found myself driving past the house at odd hours, watching for signs of activity, though I wasn't sure what I expected to see. The windows remained dark, the garden grew wilder, and the for sale sign in the front yard accumulated weather stains and bird droppings. Then one morning the sign was gone. I called the realtor expecting to hear that the sale had gone through. Instead, she told me the listing had been withdrawn. The owner had decided not to sell after all. He was moving back in, she said, something about needing to face his memories instead of running from them. That night I saw lights in the study window. I sat in my car across the street, watching the warm glow behind the curtains I'd pulled back weeks earlier. A shadow moved past the window, tall, familiar, unmistakably the husband. He was in the room where his wife had spent her final evening, perhaps sitting in the same chair where I'd made my disturbing discoveries. Was he reading the poetry book? Did he know about the annotations, the coded messages, the final desperate note? Or was there something else in that room, something I'd missed entirely, that had drawn him back to the place he'd claimed he could never bear to revisit? I never filed my final report. The insurance company called several times, asking for my assessment, but I found myself unable to put my conclusions into words that made sense. How do you document suspicions that shift like shadows? How do you present evidence that might be nothing more than wishful thinking? The case remains officially open, though I suspect it will eventually be processed as a standard accidental death claim. The husband will receive his payout if he hasn't already. The house will either be sold or remain a private monument to whatever really happened there. And I will continue to drive past it sometimes, looking for answers to questions I'm no longer sure I want answered. Because I've come to realize that some truths are too complex for the neat categories we use to organize our understanding of the world. Some stories resist resolution, existing instead in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between what we know and what we fear we might discover if we look too closely. The woman in the poetry book understood this, I think. Her annotations weren't just planning documents or coded messages, they were attempts to map the unmappable territory between truth and fiction, between the life she was living and the life she imagined might be possible. Whether she found her way to that other life or whether it found her first remains a mystery that haunts me still. Story 7. It wasn't the first morning that the garden tools were damp. The shed door had a habit of creaking open just wide enough for a draft to pass through, allowing the hint of soil and wood to intermingle in the air. I often brushed specks of dirt from my trousers, ground soft from overnight showers. The path through the grass remained unchanged, although the footprint seemed deeper, more deliberate. I straightened the outdoor mat, its fibers worn from constant use. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that lingers without rain. I watched the shadows stretch further than usual, then stepped back inside and left the door ajar. I knew exactly what had happened that night. My neighbor had been working late in their garden again, borrowing tools without asking. It was a simple explanation for something that barely qualified as a mystery. They'd done it before, always returning everything by morning, always careful to close the shed door most of the way. The dampness came from the morning dew settling on metal surfaces. The deeper footprints were just my imagination, or perhaps the ground had softened more than usual after the recent weather. The routine had become familiar over the past few weeks. I'd wake up, make coffee, and walk outside to check the small vegetable garden I'd been tending. The shed would be slightly open, tools arranged almost exactly as I'd left them, but not quite. A shovel leaning at a different angle. The hand rake moved 6 inches to the left. Nothing missing, nothing damaged, just the subtle signs that someone had been there. I'd mentioned it to my neighbor during one of our brief conversations over the fence. They'd smiled and nodded, neither confirming nor denying anything. Their own garden was impressive, much more elaborate than mine, with raised beds and a greenhouse that caught the morning light. It made sense they'd need extra tools sometimes. I didn't mind the informal borrowing arrangement. In fact, I found it oddly comforting to know someone was making good use of equipment that often sat idle. The coffee tasted bitter that morning as I stood at the kitchen window, watching the empty yard. My neighbor's house remained dark, curtains drawn. They were probably sleeping in after another late night of gardening. I'd heard the soft sounds of digging and moving around well past midnight, the gentle scraping of metal against earth. Dedicated gardeners often worked by moonlight, especially during the cooler months when daytime heat made outdoor labor uncomfortable. But as I sipped my coffee, something nagged at me. The footprints I'd noticed weren't heading toward my neighbor's house. They led from the shed to the far corner of my own property, where a cluster of old oak trees created a natural boundary. I set down my mug and walked back outside, following the impressions in the soft ground. The prints were clearer now in the morning light. Boot prints, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive tread pattern that left diamond-shaped marks in the mud. They moved with purpose from the shed toward the trees, then seemed to circle back toward the house before disappearing on the harder ground near the patio. I knelt down and examined one of the clearer impressions. The depth suggested someone carrying weight, moving slowly and deliberately. I tried to remember if I'd ever seen my neighbor wearing boots with that particular tread pattern. Most of our conversations happened across the fence, and I rarely paid attention to footwear, but something about the size seemed wrong. My neighbor was shorter than me, probably wearing a size 8 or 9 shoe. These prints looked bigger, made by someone with a longer stride. The unease crept in gradually, like cold water seeping through fabric. I walked the perimeter of my property, looking for other signs of disturbance. Near the oak trees, I found a small area where the fallen leaves had been swept aside, revealing dark soil underneath. The earth looked freshly turned, though not recently planted, just disturbed as if someone had been digging and then tried to cover their work. I stood there for several minutes, trying to construct a reasonable explanation. Maybe my neighbor had been helping with some landscaping project I'd forgotten about. Or perhaps they'd been looking for something they'd lost in my yard, but I couldn't recall any conversations about landscaping, and the secretive timing of these visits made less sense now. The shed door creaked in the breeze, drawing my attention back to the tools. I walked over and examined them more carefully. The shovel blade was clean, but when I looked closer, I could see traces of soil in the joints where the metal met the wooden handle. Not the light, sandy soil from my vegetable garden, but something darker and more clay-like. The kind of heavy earth that came from digging deeper, below the topsoil layer. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the shovel. The weight felt different somehow, heavier with implication. I tried to remember the last time I'd used it myself, several days ago, maybe a week. I'd been planting bulbs in the front flower bed, working in the lighter soil that drained well and stayed soft. This residue was different, clinging and dense. I set the tool down and walked back to the disturbed area under the oaks. The morning shadows made it difficult to see clearly, but as I knelt and brushed away more leaves, the extent of the digging became apparent. Someone had excavated a roughly rectangular area, maybe 3 feet by 6 feet, and then filled it back in. The work had been careful but not perfect. The replaced soil sat slightly higher than the surrounding ground, and the color was subtly different where subsoil had been mixed with topsoil. The rational part of my mind offered explanations: a water line repair, a septic system issue, some kind of utility work that I'd forgotten about or never been told about. But those explanations felt thin, stretched over a growing certainty that something else had happened here. I thought about the sounds I'd been hearing at night, the soft scraping and digging that I'd attributed to enthusiastic gardening. Had I really heard metal against earth, or had it been something else? The sounds of filling rather than planting. And why would anyone work in my yard instead of their own, especially at night, especially without asking? The morning air felt colder now, carrying scents I hadn't noticed before. Under the familiar smell of damp earth and decomposing leaves, there was something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like fruit that had been left too long in the sun. I'd noticed it before but dismissed it as natural forest smells, the normal process of decay that happened under any grove of trees. I stood up quickly, brushing dirt from my knees. The sweet smell seemed stronger near the disturbed ground, and I found myself stepping away from it instinctively. My rational mind fought against the implications, insisting that I was overreacting to perfectly normal suburban mysteries. Borrowed tools, a little unauthorized digging, some unusual smells in a wooded area, nothing that couldn't be explained by mundane circumstances. But as I walked back toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been living alongside something terrible without recognizing it. The familiar routine of damp tools and open shed doors took on a sinister cast. Instead of a helpful neighbor, I began to imagine someone using my property for purposes I didn't want to consider. The coffee had gone cold by the time I returned to the kitchen. I poured it out and made a fresh pot, trying to restore some normalcy to the morning. But my eyes kept drifting to the window, to the grove of oaks where the ground had been disturbed. I found myself wondering how long the digging had been going on, and whether the rectangular patch was the only area that had been excavated. I'd been so focused on the shed and the borrowed tools that I'd never really examined my property carefully. The yard was large, with several areas where trees and bushes created natural privacy screens. Someone could have been working in multiple locations without me noticing, especially if they were careful to restore the surface appearance afterward. The thought sent me back outside with a systematic plan. I walked the entire perimeter of my property, looking for other signs of disturbance. Behind the garage, I found another area where the ground seemed uneven, though it was harder to tell because of the gravel and concrete surfaces nearby. Near the back fence, a section of lawn looked patchy, as if sod had been removed and replaced imperfectly. Each discovery made my previous certainty seem more naive. This wasn't casual tool borrowing or simple trespassing. Someone had been using my property extensively, working at night when I was asleep or distracted. The scope of the activity suggested planning and purpose that went far beyond anything I could explain innocently. I tried to remember when the pattern had started. The damp tools in the morning, the slightly open shed door. Had it really been only a few weeks, or had I been noticing these signs for longer without paying attention? My memory felt unreliable now, contaminated by my growing suspicion. What I'd interpreted as minor annoyances might have been evidence of something much more serious. The neighbor I'd assumed was responsible seemed less likely now. The scale of the digging, the different locations, the careful timing. It suggested someone with more intimate knowledge of my schedule and habits. Someone who knew when I went to bed, when I woke up, when I was likely to be distracted or away from home. I found myself studying the windows of the surrounding houses, wondering who might have a clear view of my backyard. Most of the neighboring properties had their own privacy screens of trees and fences, but there were angles and sight lines that would allow observation. Someone could have been watching me for weeks or months, learning my routines and identifying opportunities. The paranoia felt both irrational and completely justified. I was standing in my own yard, looking at evidence of unauthorized digging, holding tools that had been used by someone else for unknown purposes. The sweet smell under the oak trees lingered in my memory, organic and wrong. Everything I dismissed as harmless now seemed potentially sinister. But the most disturbing realization was how easily I'd been fooled. I'd created an entire narrative about helpful neighbors and informal tool sharing, building a comfortable explanation for signs that should have alarmed me. I'd been living above or beside something terrible while telling myself a pleasant story about community cooperation. As I stood in my kitchen looking out at the yard I thought I knew, I wondered what else I'd been wrong about. The sounds at night, the patterns of disturbance, the identity of whoever had been working in my soil. I'd been so confident in my interpretation of events, but that confidence now seemed like willful blindness. The morning light continued to shift and change, revealing details that had been hidden in shadow. But instead of bringing clarity, each new observation deepened the mystery. I knew someone had been using my property for purposes I didn't understand, digging in locations I hadn't chosen, leaving behind smells and signs that made my skin crawl. What I didn't know was who or why or what I might find if I started digging myself. The tools were still there in the shed, waiting to reveal whatever had been buried in my own backyard while I slept peacefully, unaware that my quiet suburban life had become something else entirely. Story 8. It wasn't unusual for the mail to pile up on the table. Envelopes, some unopened, stacked neatly, forming a small tower that swayed only slightly when the door shut. The light through the window settled quietly over everything, highlighting the dust collected on surfaces, giving the impression of untouched order. I rearranged the letters sometimes, aligning them with the edge, ensuring the pile remained stable. The messages inside, I imagined, remained sealed away for now. Each day the stack leaned a bit more, but I never opened them. I turned the radio on low, letting the quiet hum fill the room. Occasionally I glanced at the notepad by the phone, its pages blank, undisturbed. I didn't write anything down. I understood why she stopped opening the mail. The routine had become too much for her, the daily ritual of sorting through bills and advertisements, the weight of correspondence from people who didn't know she was gone. I was handling everything now, making sure the house stayed exactly as she would have wanted it. The kitchen counters remained clean, the coffee maker unplugged, the dish towel folded over the sink's edge in that particular way she always arranged it. She had been careful about these details, methodical in her habits. Every morning she would stack the mail just so, never letting it scatter across the table's surface. Even when her arthritis made her fingers stiff, she maintained that precision. I respected that now, continuing the pattern she had established over so many quiet mornings. The detective had explained everything clearly during our last conversation. Natural causes, he said. Her heart simply stopped working sometime during the night. No signs of struggle, no indication of distress. She had gone to bed as usual, turned off the lamp on her nightstand, and never woken up. The coroner confirmed what we already suspected at her age. These things happen. Peaceful, really. The way most people hope to go. I found her 3 days later when I came by for our usual visit. The spare key was still under the flower pot where she always kept it, the front door unlocked from the inside. She looked smaller somehow, lying there in her bed, wearing the pale blue nightgown she favored. Her reading glasses were folded on the nightstand next to a book she'd been working through, a bookmark placed exactly halfway through the pages. The mail had been piling up since then. I couldn't bring myself to open letters addressed to someone who would never read them again. Instead, I maintained her system, keeping everything organized the way she would have appreciated. It felt like the right thing to do. But something started bothering me about a week later. A small detail that hadn't registered immediately, something I noticed while straightening the living room. The bookmark in her book was positioned differently than I remembered, not dramatically different, just moved back a few pages, as if she had been rereading a section she'd already finished. I told myself I was misremembering. Grief does that to people, makes them notice things that aren't really there, attach significance to coincidences. The bookmark could have shifted when I moved through the house, or when the detective conducted his initial examination. These things happen. Yet the feeling persisted. I began paying closer attention to other details, comparing what I saw now to my memories of that first day. The coffee maker, which I was certain had been unplugged, showed a small red light indicating it was still connected to power. The dish towel over the sink wasn't folded in her usual neat triangle. Instead, it hung loose, one corner dipping toward the basin. I started visiting the house more frequently, telling myself I was simply maintaining the property, making sure everything stayed secure. But really, I was studying the space, trying to reconcile these small discrepancies with what I thought I knew about her final days. The mail continued accumulating. Bills from the electric company, advertisements for life insurance, a letter from her doctor's office confirming an appointment she would never keep. I found myself examining the postmarks more carefully, noting which pieces had arrived before her death and which had come after. Most of the recent mail made sense, automatic mailings from companies that hadn't been notified of her passing yet. But there was one envelope that troubled me, a handwritten letter with no return address, postmarked just 2 days before I found her. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. The envelope was thin, suggesting a brief message inside. It sat near the bottom of the pile, meaning she would have seen it, probably handled it. I held the envelope up to the window, trying to see through the paper without actually opening it. The light revealed nothing useful, just the shadow of folded pages inside. My hands trembled slightly as I set it back down. Opening someone else's mail felt like a violation, even now. The radio continued its low murmur in the background, cycling through the same local news updates and weather reports. I realized I'd been hearing the same stories for days now, the same announcements about traffic conditions and community events. The repetition was oddly comforting, like a heartbeat in an otherwise silent house. I tried to remember our last conversation more clearly. She had seemed tired, but not unusually so. We discussed her garden, the way the roses were struggling in the heat, her plans to trim back the hedges before winter. Normal topics, everyday concerns. Nothing that suggested she was worried about anything specific. But there had been a moment just as I was leaving when she'd asked me about the neighbors, whether I'd noticed anyone unfamiliar in the area, any cars parked where they didn't belong. I'd assumed she was just being cautious, the way older people often become more aware of their surroundings. I'd reassured her that everything looked normal, told her not to worry. Now that conversation took on a different weight. Had she been genuinely concerned about something or someone? The question gnawed at me as I moved through her house, touching surfaces she had touched, sitting in chairs where she had spent her final days. The detective's report mentioned that her doors were locked when I arrived, but I knew she always kept the front door unlocked during the day. She'd grown up in a time when people didn't worry about such things, and the habit had persisted despite my gentle suggestions about security. Finding that door locked struck me as odd, though I hadn't mentioned it at the time. I began checking other details more systematically. Her pill organizer, which she filled every week with meticulous care, was missing 2 days' worth of medication. Not the days after her death, the days before. As if she had simply stopped taking her pills, despite their importance for her blood pressure and heart condition. The phone by her bed showed several missed calls in the days leading up to her death. I pressed the button to review them, listening to the automated voice recite numbers I didn't recognize. No messages had been left, just the record of incoming calls that had gone unanswered. The timing bothered me. These calls had come during hours when she was usually home, usually quick to answer. I found myself staying later each evening, reluctant to leave the house empty. The silence felt different now, charged with questions I couldn't answer. Every creak of the floorboards, every settling sound from the walls seemed to carry meaning. I started taking notes on a pad I'd brought from home, documenting the small inconsistencies I was discovering. The handwritten letter remained unopened, but I found myself returning to it repeatedly, studying the envelope as if it might reveal its contents through careful observation. The handwriting was definitely familiar, though I still couldn't place it. The ink looked fresh, not faded like correspondence that had been sitting for weeks. One evening, while adjusting the mail pile, I noticed something that made me stop completely. There were 2 envelopes with the same return address or bank, but they were dated differently. One had arrived before her death, the other after. The later envelope was thicker, more substantial. When I held them both, the difference in weight was noticeable. I realized I would have to start opening some of these letters. Not all of them, just the ones that might contain important information about her affairs, her accounts, anything that needed immediate attention. It was a responsibility I'd been avoiding, but it could no longer be delayed. The bank statements told a story I hadn't expected. Large withdrawals in the weeks before her death, cash transactions that seemed out of character for someone who rarely dealt in amounts larger than grocery money. The most recent statement showed her account balance was significantly lower than I'd anticipated, given her careful spending habits and modest lifestyle. There were also deposits I couldn't explain. Irregular amounts, always in cash, appearing sporadically over the past several months. The timing didn't correspond to any income source I knew about. Her pension and Social Security were automatically deposited, and these additional amounts followed no discernible pattern. The handwritten letter seemed to pulse with significance now, demanding attention. I picked it up again, turning it over in my hands, feeling the slight thickness of the paper inside. Whatever message it contained might explain the financial irregularities, or at least provide some context for her behavior in those final weeks. I opened it carefully, trying not to tear the envelope. The letter inside was brief, written in the same familiar handwriting. The message was simple but unsettling. "We need to talk about what you saw. Meet me at the usual place." No signature, no additional explanation, just those 2 sentences, written in blue ink on plain white paper. The handwriting suddenly clicked into place. I recognized it now, though the realization brought more confusion than clarity. It was my own handwriting, my own words, but I had no memory of writing this letter, no recollection of sending it to her. The usual place, what usual place? We always met at her house, had done so for months without variation. I stared at the letter until the words seemed to blur together. Had I written this and forgotten? Was it possible I'd been so stressed, so overwhelmed by other responsibilities, that I'd lost track of my own actions? The idea was disturbing, but I couldn't dismiss it entirely. I searched through my own papers when I got home, looking for any evidence that I'd written similar letters, any indication of what I might have meant by what you saw. My handwriting samples matched perfectly, but I found no drafts, no notes that might explain the message. The next day I returned to her house with a growing sense of unease. The mail pile seemed different somehow, though I couldn't identify exactly what had changed. The envelopes were still stacked neatly, still aligned with the table's edge, but something about their arrangement felt wrong. I started going through more of her papers, looking for clues about these mysterious deposits and withdrawals, any evidence of what she might have seen that required discussion. Her record-keeping was typically meticulous, but there were gaps in her documentation that corresponded exactly with the unexplained financial activity. In a drawer I'd never opened before, I found a small notebook filled with dates and times, written in her careful script. The entries were cryptic, just combinations of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me, but the dates aligned with both the unusual bank transactions and the missed phone calls I'd discovered earlier. The notebook's final entry was dated the day before her death. Instead of the usual coded notation, she had written something in plain English. "He doesn't remember, but I do. What happens now?" The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in the house. The pronoun was unmistakably masculine, and given the context of my own letter, it seemed to refer to me. But what didn't I remember? What was she referring to? I found myself questioning not just her final days, but my own recent memories. Had there been conversations I'd forgotten, meetings that had slipped from my recollection? The possibility that I was losing pieces of my own experience was terrifying, but I couldn't ignore the evidence accumulating around me. The detective had been so certain about the cause of death, so confident in his assessment of the scene. But had he known about the financial irregularities, the mysterious phone calls, the locked door that should have been unlocked? I realized I'd accepted his conclusions without question, trusting his expertise over my own observations. Now sitting in her living room with the late afternoon light filtering through the windows, I wondered if I'd been too quick to embrace the simple explanation. Natural causes, peaceful death, nothing suspicious. It was the story everyone wanted to believe, including me. But stories and truth aren't always the same thing. The mail pile continued to grow, each day bringing new envelopes that would never be opened by their intended recipient. I'd become the guardian of her correspondence, the keeper of messages meant for someone else. But maybe I'd been more than that all along. Maybe I'd been part of whatever story had ended with her death, a participant rather than just an observer. The radio murmured its familiar loop of local news and weather, but now I found myself listening more carefully to the details, wondering if I'd missed something important in those repeated broadcasts. The same stories day after day, but perhaps with small variations I hadn't noticed before. As darkness began to settle over the house, I realized I no longer knew which version of events to trust: the official explanation, my own memories, or the evidence that seemed to contradict both. The truth felt like something I could almost grasp, hovering just beyond my understanding, waiting for me to remember what I'd apparently chosen to forget. The unopened letters seemed to watch me from their neat pile on the table, holding secrets I might never be ready to discover. But ready or not, I knew I would keep coming back to this house, keep searching through the carefully maintained order she'd left behind, trying to understand what had really happened in those final days. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a question was forming that I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. If I couldn't remember writing that letter, what else might I have forgotten? Story 9. The latch clicked shut behind me as I exhaled. The scent of dust mingled with a faint hint of lavender, clouding the air like a forgotten memory. My fingers brushed against the textured wallpaper, which felt rougher than it had before. A chill crept up my spine, settling in my shoulders. The usual creaking of the floor seemed to have shifted, quieter and more cautious. I paused, realizing the air around me had grown still, almost listening. The gentle hum of the house felt unfamiliar now, as if it were breathing differently, almost expectantly. That smell, always that smell when I try to remember. I was standing in the hallway, wasn't I? Or maybe the kitchen. The details blur together like watercolors in rain. There was a photograph on the mantel, face down. Had it always been that way? My hand reached toward it, then stopped. Something about touching it felt wrong, like disturbing a sleeping animal. The lavender scent grows stronger when I think about her voice. Soft, careful words that seem to float just above whispers. She was telling me something important, something I needed to remember, but the words keep slipping away like smoke through my fingers. "You have to understand," she said, or did she? The memory fractures, splits into pieces that don't quite fit together anymore. I remember the way shadows fell across the carpet in the afternoon. Long, reaching fingers that stretched toward the staircase. The house felt larger then, full of spaces I hadn't noticed before, corners that seemed deeper, doorways that led to rooms I couldn't quite recall entering. There was a sound, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails against wood. It came from upstairs or maybe from the walls themselves. When I followed it, the sound would stop, leaving only the echo of my own footsteps on the hardwood. She was always moving things, small things, a cup from one table to another, books rearranged on shelves, keys that weren't where I'd left them. When I asked about it, she would smile that careful smile and say she was just tidying up, but her eyes never quite met mine when she said it. The photograph bothers me. In my memory, it shows two people standing close together, but when I try to focus on their faces, they blur. One of them might be me. The other is harder to place, like looking at someone through frosted glass. I was looking for something that day, something important. My hands searched through drawers, moved papers aside, checked pockets of coats hanging in the closet. But what was I looking for? The harder I try to remember, the more the memory shifts and changes. There was a conversation in the kitchen, low voices, urgent whispers. I stood just outside the doorway, listening to words I couldn't quite make out. The tone was wrong, though, worried, frightened maybe. When I stepped into the room, the talking stopped so suddenly it felt like walking into a wall of silence. The lavender scent was strongest near the back door. It clung to the air there, heavy and sweet, almost medicinal. Sometimes I would find her standing by that door, looking out at the garden with an expression I couldn't read. When she noticed me watching, she would turn away quickly, busying herself with some small task. I keep coming back to the photograph. In one memory, it's sitting upright, showing those two blurred faces. In another, it's face down, as if someone deliberately turned it over. But which memory is real? They feel equally true and equally false, like trying to choose between two different dreams. The tapping sound returns when I think about the upstairs rooms. It's not random, I realize now. There's a pattern to it, like a code or a signal. 3 short taps, then silence. 3 more, then silence again. When I followed it, the sound always seemed to be coming from just around the next corner, always one room ahead of where I was searching. She had a habit of standing very still when she thought I wasn't looking. Not reading, not cleaning, not doing anything at all, just standing as if she were listening for something. When I asked what she was waiting for, she would startle as if she'd forgotten I was there. The house itself seemed to be changing. Rooms felt different sizes than they had before. The hallway stretched longer, the ceiling seemed lower. Even the light fell differently through the windows, casting shadows in places where there had been none before. I began to wonder if I was remembering the layout correctly, or if my memory was playing tricks on me. There was something in her hands that day, small, metallic. It caught the light when she moved, sending brief flashes across the wall. When I asked to see it, she closed her fingers around it and shook her head. "Not yet," she said, or maybe she said, "Not you." The words sound so similar now, I can't tell which one I actually heard. The back door was always locked, 3 different locks actually, which seemed excessive for such a quiet neighborhood. But when I asked about it, she said you could never be too careful. The way she said it made me think she was being careful about something specific, not just general caution. I found myself checking the photograph more often, trying to catch it in the act of changing. Sometimes it was upright, sometimes face down. Once I could have sworn it was turned at an angle, as if someone had bumped into the mantel and knocked it slightly askew. But when I blinked, it was face down again, settled firmly against the wood. The smell of lavender began to feel oppressive, too thick, like breathing through fabric. It seemed to follow me from room to room, growing stronger in places where I lingered too long. I started opening windows, but the scent remained, as if it had soaked into the walls themselves. She was writing something. I glimpsed her at the kitchen table, bent over papers, her hand moving quickly across the page. When I entered the room, she would cover the writing with her arm and look up with that careful smile. "Just making lists," she would say, but what kind of lists required such secrecy? The tapping sound came from inside the walls now, I was sure of it, not from the rooms themselves, but from the spaces between them. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, feeling its rough texture against my cheek, listening for the pattern. 3 taps, silence, 3 taps, like someone trying to communicate from a place they couldn't escape. I began to notice that certain objects appeared and disappeared. A book I'd been reading would vanish from the coffee table, only to reappear on a shelf I rarely used. My keys would move from the bowl by the door to a drawer in the kitchen. When I mentioned these small migrations, she would look puzzled and suggest I must have moved them myself and forgotten. But I wasn't forgetting, was I? The photograph became an obsession. I would check it multiple times each day, trying to catch the moment when it changed position. But it was like watching a clock tick. The movement always seemed to happen when I wasn't looking. I considered staying in the room, keeping my eyes fixed on it, but something about that idea filled me with dread. Her careful smile began to feel like a mask. Behind it, I sensed something else, something watchful and waiting. She would ask innocent questions about my day, my plans, where I was going, and when I would be back. The questions felt casual, but she listened to my answers with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The lavender scent was everywhere now, in my clothes, in my hair, on my skin. I couldn't escape it, couldn't wash it away. It had become part of me, or I had become part of it. Sometimes I wondered if other people could smell it too, if they could tell just by looking at me that something was wrong. I started having dreams about the house. In them, the rooms were arranged differently, connected by hallways that didn't exist in waking life. I would search for familiar spaces and find them changed, transformed into something alien and threatening. The photograph appeared in these dreams too, but when I looked at it, the faces were clearer, too clear, clear enough to recognize, clear enough to understand. The tapping sound was coming from behind the photograph. I realized this with sudden, terrible certainty. All this time, I'd been searching the wrong places, following false echoes. The sound was coming from the wall behind the mantel, from the space where the photograph sat. When I approached it the final time, my hands were shaking. The lavender scent was so strong it made my eyes water. I could hear her moving in the next room, that careful, deliberate movement that had become so familiar. The photograph felt warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though the room was dim. I turned it over. The faces looked back at me, clear now, unmistakable. But there were 3 people in the photograph, not 2. 3 people, though I could only account for 2. The third figure stood slightly behind the others, partially obscured but definitely there. Someone I should recognize but couldn't quite place. Someone who should have been there but wasn't. The tapping stopped. The house went completely silent. Even the usual settling sounds ceased. In that silence, I understood what I had been trying so hard not to remember, what my mind had been protecting me from knowing. The lavender scent wasn't coming from her at all. It was coming from the walls, from the spaces between rooms, from the place where the tapping had originated. The place where someone had been trying to get my attention, trying to remind me of what I had forgotten. Or what I had been made to forget. I set the photograph back down, but I couldn't make myself turn it face down again. Those 3 faces stared up at me, and now I could see the truth in their expressions. Not happiness, not contentment, something else entirely. Something like fear. The latch clicks shut behind me as I enter the house again, the scent of dust mingling with that faint hint of lavender. My fingers brush against the textured wallpaper, which feels exactly as rough as it always has. But now I know what the house has been trying to tell me, what the photograph has been trying to show me. I know who the third person is. I know why she's been moving things, checking locks, asking careful questions with that watchful smile. I know what the tapping sound was and why it's finally stopped. But knowing and remembering are different things, aren't they? And some memories are too dangerous to keep, too terrible to hold on to. So I let this one slip away too, like smoke through my fingers, like words whispered too softly to understand. The photograph sits on the mantel, face down again. I don't remember turning it over. The lavender scent fades to something barely noticeable, just a hint in the air like a forgotten memory. And somewhere in the walls, in the spaces between rooms, the silence grows deeper. Story 10. It wasn't unusual for the back door to creak in the wind. I've heard it countless times, each groan blending seamlessly into the drone of evening shows from the static-filled TV. The hallway was always dimly lit, the low bulb making shadows slither over the wallpaper, sometimes settling in corners that should have been empty. This evening, the dampness in the air carried a scent I didn't associate with rain, yet I didn't open the window to check. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, its hands moving in unison, marking time that seemed to stretch and warp. I noticed the smudge on the floor just beside the mahogany console, a faint trail leading to the doorway. I kept walking, my footsteps muffled by the carpet's weave. I glanced at the phone, the receiver slightly off its cradle. Instead of fixing it, I decided to let it be. The dampness clung to my skin like a memory I couldn't shake. I found myself touching the wall as I passed, feeling the familiar texture of the wallpaper beneath my fingertips. The pattern had always been there, small roses repeating endlessly, but tonight they seemed to blur together in my peripheral vision. The scent grew stronger as I moved deeper into the house, metallic and sweet, like copper pennies left in summer heat. My sister had called earlier, or perhaps it was yesterday. The conversation replayed in fragments, her voice tight with something she wouldn't name. She'd asked about the house, about whether I'd noticed anything different. I told her no, which felt true when I said it. But standing here now, breathing in this strange air, I wondered what I might have missed. The living room felt smaller than usual. The furniture hadn't moved, yet the space between the couch and coffee table seemed compressed, as if the walls had shifted inward while I wasn't looking. I sat in my usual chair, the one facing the window, and tried to remember what had brought me here tonight. The routine of checking locks, adjusting thermostats, ensuring everything was as it should be. But the details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The phone receiver dangled by its cord, swaying slightly. I could hear the dial tone from across the room, a steady hum that competed with the television's murmur. Someone had been using it recently. The plastic still held the warmth of skin contact, though I couldn't recall making any calls myself. My sister's number was written on a slip of paper beside the base, her handwriting familiar yet somehow foreign in this context. I picked up the receiver and listened to the silence on the other end before the dial tone resumed. There was something beneath that electronic hum, a faint crackling that suggested the line had been active recently. I replaced it in its cradle, but the slight displacement remained, as if it refused to sit properly. The smudge on the floor drew my attention again. In better light, it might have been mud or spilled coffee, but the hallway's dim bulb cast everything in uncertain shades. I knelt and touched the edge of it with my finger. The substance had dried but left a residue that felt gritty, like sand mixed with something thicker. The trail led toward the back door, then seemed to double back on itself, creating a pattern I couldn't decipher. My sister had keys to this house. So did the neighbor, though we rarely spoke beyond polite greetings. The back door key hung on a hook beside the kitchen window, where anyone could see it through the thin curtains. I'd always meant to move it somewhere more secure, but the intention never translated into action. The television continued its background chatter, laugh tracks and commercial jingles creating a soundtrack to my growing unease. I found the remote and muted the sound, letting silence fill the spaces between the clocks ticking and the door's intermittent creaking. In this quiet, other sounds emerged, the house settling, pipes expanding and contracting, the whisper of air moving through vents. I walked to the kitchen, following the smudged trail. The linoleum felt cold through my socks, and I noticed my footprints leaving faint impressions on the surface. The back door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it earlier. The gap was narrow, perhaps an inch, but enough to let in the night air and that persistent, unidentifiable scent. The kitchen window above the sink framed a view of the backyard, where shadows pooled beneath the old oak tree. Something pale caught my eye near the base of the trunk, but when I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogged the surface, obscuring the view. By the time I wiped it clear, whatever I'd seen was gone, leaving only the familiar landscape of grass and garden beds. I checked the door's lock mechanism. It turned easily, too easily, as if the tumblers had been recently lubricated. The deadbolt slid home with a soft click, but I could feel the slight give in the frame, the way the wood had warped over the years to create gaps that determined intruders might exploit. My sister's last visit came back to me in pieces. She'd stood in this same kitchen, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that steamed in the afternoon light. Her eyes had been red-rimmed, though she insisted she wasn't crying. We talked about practical things, maintenance issues, utility bills, the neighbor's new fence. But underneath our conversation ran an undercurrent of tension, words we weren't saying, questions we weren't asking. She'd mentioned seeing lights in the house when it should have been empty. I'd explained about the timer switches, the security measures meant to simulate occupancy. But her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, or perhaps she knew something I didn't. The coffee mug still sat in the sink, unwashed. I ran my finger around its rim, feeling the residue of lipstick she'd been wearing. The shade was darker than her usual choice, burgundy instead of her preferred pink. Small details like this had begun to accumulate, tiny discrepancies that individually meant nothing, but collectively suggested a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. I filled the mug with water and watched the lipstick dissolve, creating swirls of color that reminded me of the smudge on the hallway floor. The water ran pink, then clear, carrying away the evidence of her presence. But the scent lingered in the kitchen, her perfume mixed with something else, something that made my stomach tighten with unnameable dread. The refrigerator hummed to life, its motor vibrating through the floor and up into my bones. I opened it and found the interior exactly as I'd left it, but somehow the arrangement of items seemed deliberate, as if someone had been searching through the contents and carefully replaced everything. The milk carton faced forward, its expiration date visible. The condiments in the door stood in perfect rows, labels aligned. I closed the refrigerator and noticed my reflection in its stainless steel surface, distorted and unfamiliar. My face looked older in this funhouse mirror, eyes deeper set, mouth drawn into lines of worry I didn't remember developing. Behind my reflection, the kitchen stretched away in warped perspective, making the familiar space seem alien and threatening. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the house's quiet. I let it ring twice before walking back to the living room, each step measured and deliberate. The caller ID display showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the sequence of digits felt familiar, like a melody I'd heard before but couldn't place. I lifted the receiver on the fourth ring. Hello. Silence greeted me, but not the empty silence of a disconnected line. This was the silence of someone listening, breathing quietly, waiting. I could feel their presence through the connection, patient and watchful. "I know you're there," I said, though I wasn't sure why. The line went dead with a soft click, leaving me holding the receiver and staring at the wall. The caller ID had already reset, showing only the time in green digital numerals. I tried to recall the number, but the digits had already faded from memory like smoke dissipating in wind. My sister had asked me to check on things, but I was beginning to understand that the things she wanted me to check weren't locks and thermostats. They were subtler, more elusive. The sense that someone had been here, that privacy had been violated in ways that left no obvious evidence. I returned to the hallway and examined the smudge more carefully. In the dim light, it almost looked like a partial footprint, the kind that might be left by someone trying to walk quietly, distributing their weight to minimize sound. The pattern suggested someone moving from the back door toward the front of the house, then returning, perhaps carrying something that dripped or leaked. The wallpaper's rose pattern seemed to shift as I stared at it, the flowers rearranging themselves into new configurations. I blinked hard and the illusion passed, but the disorientation lingered. How long had I been in this house tonight? The question felt important, but I couldn't anchor myself to any specific timeline. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step creaking under my weight. The sound echoed differently than usual, as if the house's acoustics had somehow changed. At the top of the stairs, I paused and listened. The silence here felt thicker, more oppressive, broken only by the distant ticking of the mantel clock below. The bedroom doors stood open, revealing interiors shrouded in darkness. I switched on the hall light and immediately noticed that one of the doors, the one leading to the guest room, bore fresh scratches around the lock. The gouges in the wood were pale against the darker stain, suggesting recent damage. Inside the guest room, everything appeared normal at first glance. The bed was made, the dresser clear of personal items, the closet door closed. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the hallway, I noticed subtle signs of disturbance. The bedspread was wrinkled in a pattern that suggested someone had sat on its edge. The carpet showed the impression of footprints leading from the door to the window. I approached the window and found it unlocked, though I was certain it had been secured during my last visit. The glass was clean on the inside, but smudged on the exterior, as if someone had pressed their face against it while looking in. Below, the roof of the back porch created a platform that an agile person might use to gain access to the second floor. The view from this window encompassed the backyard and part of the neighbor's property. A light burned in their kitchen window, and I could see movement behind the curtains, shadowy figures going about their evening routines. Had they noticed anything unusual? Would they tell me if they had? I closed and locked the window, then tested the mechanism to ensure it held securely. The metal was cold under my fingers, and I noticed that my hands were trembling slightly, though I couldn't say whether from cold or nerves. Back downstairs, I found myself drawn to the mahogany console where I'd first noticed the smudge. The piece of furniture was old, inherited from family members whose faces were growing dim in my memory. Its drawers had always stuck slightly, requiring a firm pull to open them. Tonight, they slid smoothly, as if someone had recently oiled the runners. Inside the top drawer, I found the usual collection of household detritus: rubber bands, expired coupons, pens that no longer worked. But underneath these items, I discovered something that made me pause. A small key I didn't recognize, its metal bright and new compared to the tarnished brass of the house keys on my ring. The key was small enough to fit a jewelry box or desk drawer, but I couldn't think of any locks in the house that would match it. I held it up to the light, looking for any identifying marks or numbers, but its surface was smooth and unmarked. The weight of it in my palm felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. My sister's voice echoed in my memory, asking if I'd noticed anything different. This key was certainly different, but what did it unlock? I tried it in the console's other drawers, but it was too small for those locks. The same was true for the desk in the study and the filing cabinet in the basement. The basement, I hadn't been down there tonight, hadn't even considered it until now. The thought of descending those narrow stairs into the underground darkness made my skin crawl, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. If someone had been in the house, they might have left other signs of their presence in places I rarely visited. The basement door opened with a groan of protest, releasing air that smelled of concrete dust and old wood. I flicked the light switch and heard the fluorescent bulb buzz to life, casting harsh shadows across the cluttered space below. The stairs felt solid under my feet, but I gripped the handrail tightly, conscious of how isolated I would be down here if something went wrong. The basement was exactly as I remembered it. Boxes stacked against the walls, an old workbench covered with tools, the furnace squatting in the corner like a sleeping beast. But as I moved through the space, I noticed that some of the boxes had been shifted, their dust patterns disrupted by recent handling. One box in particular drew my attention. It sat slightly apart from the others, and when I lifted its lid, I found it contained documents and photographs I'd never seen before. The papers were legal in nature, contracts and agreements bearing signatures I didn't recognize. The photographs showed the house from various angles, some taken from positions that would have required the photographer to trespass on neighboring properties. At the bottom of the box, I found a manila envelope containing what appeared to be surveillance notes, dates, times, and brief descriptions of activities. Lights on in kitchen, car in driveway, visitor arrived, stayed 2 hours. The handwriting was neat and precise, suggesting someone with patience and attention to detail. The implications of these discoveries settled over me like a heavy blanket. Someone had been watching the house, documenting its routines, preparing for something I couldn't yet comprehend. But who? And why had these materials been left where I could find them? Was their discovery intentional, part of some larger plan? I climbed back upstairs with the envelope clutched in my hand, my mind racing through possibilities and connections. The phone rang again as I reached the living room, its sound seeming louder and more urgent than before. This time I answered immediately. "What do you want?" I asked, abandoning any pretense of politeness. The voice that responded was familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. "You found them, didn't you? The papers." Who was this? Someone who's been watching, someone who knows what really happened here. The line crackled with static, making the voice sound distant and ethereal. "What happened where? What are you talking about?" "Your sister knows. Ask her about the night she came to visit. Ask her what she was really doing in that basement." The connection ended with an abrupt click, leaving me staring at the receiver in my hand. My sister's last visit suddenly took on new significance, her nervous energy and red-rimmed eyes suggesting knowledge she hadn't shared. Had she been the one searching through boxes, leaving behind evidence of her activities? But that didn't explain the surveillance notes, the careful documentation of the house's routines. Those suggested an external observer, someone with motives I couldn't fathom, unless my sister had been working with someone else, coordinating activities that required this level of planning and observation. I spread the photographs across the coffee table, studying them for clues about when and why they'd been taken. Some showed the house in different seasons, suggesting surveillance had been ongoing for an extended period. Others focused on specific details: the back door, the guest room window, the basement entrance. One photograph made me pause. It showed me standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard. I was clearly visible through the glass, unaware that I was being watched and documented. The angle of the shot suggested it had been taken from the neighbor's property, from a position that would have provided a clear view into the house. The neighbor, I dismissed them earlier as merely someone with keys and polite greetings, but what did I really know about them? They'd lived next door for years, close enough to observe daily routines, to notice patterns and changes. They would know when the house was occupied and when it stood empty. I walked to the front window and peered through the curtains at their house. The kitchen light still burned, but the figures I'd seen earlier were gone. The building looked peaceful and ordinary, giving no hint of the secrets it might contain. The small key felt warm in my pocket, its presence a constant reminder of unanswered questions. What lock did it fit? What secrets would it reveal? I had a growing suspicion that the answers lay not in this house, but in the one next door. The back door creaked again, its familiar groan now carrying undertones of menace. I checked the lock and found it still secure, but the sound continued, rhythmic and persistent, like a signal or code. Through the kitchen window, I could see the pale shape I'd noticed earlier, still positioned beneath the oak tree. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the back porch, the night air cold against my skin. The shape resolved into a piece of white cloth, perhaps a towel or sheet, tied to the tree's lowest branch. It moved in the breeze, creating shadows that danced across the yard. As I approached the tree, I noticed that the cloth wasn't randomly placed. It had been positioned to be visible from the kitchen window, a marker or message for someone who knew to look for it. The fabric was clean and new, suggesting it had been placed recently. Beneath the tree, the ground showed signs of recent disturbance. The grass was flattened in a circular pattern, as if someone had spent considerable time here, waiting and watching. I knelt and felt the earth with my fingers, finding it still soft and yielding. A sound behind me made me turn. The neighbor stood at the fence line, their figure silhouetted against the light from their kitchen window. They raised a hand in greeting, but something about the gesture felt wrong, too casual for this strange situation. "Evening," they called, their voice carrying easily across the quiet yard. "Everything all right over there?" I stood and brushed dirt from my hands, aware that I must look suspicious kneeling in the darkness. "Just checking on things. Did you notice anyone around here recently?" "Can't say that I have, but then I'm not always watching." Their tone suggested the opposite, that watching was exactly what they'd been doing. "Someone's been in the house," I said, testing their reaction. "Is that so? Well, you might want to be more careful about those keys. Never know who might find them." The comment was pointed, almost accusatory. They knew about the key hidden by the kitchen window, probably knew about my sister's visits and the surveillance photographs, but how much more did they know? "I should get back inside," I said, backing toward the house. "Yes, you should. It's getting late, and you never know who might be watching." Their words followed me as I retreated to the back porch, locking the door firmly behind me. Through the window, I could see them still standing at the fence, their presence a reminder that privacy was an illusion in this neighborhood. Inside, the house felt different, as if my brief excursion had changed something fundamental about the space. The shadows seemed deeper, the familiar objects more sinister in their arrangement. I checked the front door and found it still locked, but the security felt fragile, easily breached by someone with determination and the right tools. The manila envelope lay open on the coffee table, its contents spread like evidence in a criminal investigation. But evidence of what crime? What had my sister done that required such careful documentation? And what role did the neighbor play in this unfolding mystery? I gathered the photographs and papers, studying them once more for details I might have missed. One document caught my attention, a property survey that showed the boundary lines between the houses. Someone had marked specific points along the fence, measurements and notations that suggested careful planning. The small key seemed to pulse in my pocket, its metal warming against my skin. I pulled it out and held it to the light, looking for any clue about its purpose. The brass was bright and untarnished, suggesting recent manufacture or careful maintenance. A new thought occurred to me. What if the key didn't belong to a lock in this house? What if it opened something next door in the neighbor's house? The surveillance notes and photographs suggested intimate knowledge of both properties, access that would require keys to multiple locations. But how could I test this theory without alerting the neighbor to my suspicions? And what would I find if the key did work? More surveillance materials, evidence of crimes I couldn't yet imagine. The phone remained silent on its cradle, but I found myself staring at it, waiting for another call that might provide answers or deepen the mystery. The caller had known about the papers in the basement, had expected me to find them. Was this all part of some elaborate plan to draw me into a situation I didn't understand? My sister's face appeared in my memory, her expression tight with secrets she wouldn't share. Had she been protecting me from knowledge that would put me in danger, or was she the source of that danger, her activities creating ripples that now threatened to engulf us both? The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, but I no longer found comfort in these sounds. They seemed to mask other noises, footsteps that might belong to intruders, voices whispering plans I couldn't hear. Every shadow held potential threats, every corner concealed possible watchers. I made my way back to the guest room, drawn by the scratches around the lock and the disturbed bedspread. In the stronger light from the hallway, I could see that someone had indeed been here recently. The pillow bore the impression of a head, and the nightstand showed rings where glasses or cups had been placed. But whose head had rested on that pillow, whose drinks had left those marks? My sister claimed to use only the downstairs rooms during her visits, but perhaps she'd been lying, concealing activities that required more privacy and security. The small key felt heavier in my hand as I examined the nightstand more closely. Its single drawer was locked, something I'd never noticed before. The keyhole was small and bright, a perfect match for the key I'd discovered in the console downstairs. My hand trembled as I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Inside the drawer, I found items that made my breath catch in my throat. More photographs, these showing people I didn't recognize in situations that looked intimate and private. Beneath the photographs lay a small recording device, its red light blinking to indicate active operation. How long had it been running? What conversations had it captured? I picked it up with shaking fingers, looking for controls that might let me play back its contents. The device was sophisticated, far beyond anything I would have expected to find in this ordinary house. Its memory card could probably hold hours of audio, weeks of surveillance data, but accessing that information would require knowledge and equipment I didn't possess. A sound from downstairs made me freeze. The back door was creaking again, but this time the rhythm was different, more deliberate. Someone was testing the lock, applying pressure to see if it would give way. I slipped the recording device into my pocket alongside the key and moved to the guest room window. Below, I could see a figure moving around the back porch, their movements careful and practiced. They wore dark clothing that made them difficult to distinguish from the shadows, but their familiarity with the house's layout was evident in how they navigated the space. I watched as they produced what looked like a key and inserted it into the back door lock. The door opened silently, admitting them into the house with an ease that suggested this wasn't their first unauthorized entry. Whoever this was, they had legitimate access or sophisticated tools for bypassing security. My position in the guest room suddenly felt precarious. I was trapped on the second floor with an intruder below, someone who clearly knew the house's layout and routines. The recording device in my pocket might contain evidence of their previous visits, but that knowledge wouldn't help me if they discovered my presence. I moved carefully toward the hallway, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak under my weight. The house's familiar sounds now worked against me, every groan and settling noise potentially masking the intruder's movements or revealing my own position. From the top of the stairs, I could see light moving through the lower rooms, a flashlight beam that swept methodically across surfaces and into corners. The intruder was searching for something, their movements purposeful rather than random. They knew what they wanted and where they might find it. The beam paused at the coffee table where I'd left the manila envelope and its contents. I heard a soft exclamation, satisfaction or surprise, then the rustle of papers being gathered. The evidence I'd discovered was being removed, erasing proof of the surveillance activities. But they hadn't found the recording device or the photographs from the nightstand drawer. Those items remained in my possession, though their value as evidence depended on my ability to escape the house and reach safety. The intruder's presence between me and the exits made that prospect increasingly unlikely. The flashlight beam began moving toward the stairs, its approach methodical and inevitable. I retreated into the guest room and considered my options. The window offered a potential escape route, but the drop to the back porch roof was significant, and any noise would alert the intruder to my location. Instead, I decided to hide and hope they would complete their business and leave without discovering me. The closet offered the best concealment, its interior dark and cluttered with old clothes and boxes. I squeezed inside and pulled the door nearly closed, leaving just enough gap to monitor the room. The footsteps on the stairs were soft but audible, someone taking care to minimize noise while still moving with purpose. They reached the second floor and paused, perhaps listening for sounds that might indicate another person's presence. I held my breath and tried to make myself invisible in the closet's depths. Light appeared under the guest room door, then the door itself opened with a gentle creak. The flashlight beam swept across the room, pausing at the bed with its disturbed covers, then moving to the nightstand with its open drawer. I heard a sharp intake of breath, surprise at finding the drawer unlocked and empty. The intruder moved closer to the clothes.